You probably clicked on this to fall asleep, but before we start, drop a like and subscribe. Now dim your lights and let the darkness begin. The gravel crunched softly under Elias' worn boots as he made his way up the gentle slope of Havenwood Cemetery. The late afternoon sun, already beginning its descent behind the peaks of the Appalachians, cast long, skeletal shadows from the ancient oaks that guarded the hallowed ground. He carried a small, familiar bucket in his right hand, the metal handle cool against his calloused palm. Inside, nestled amongst damp moss, were a dozen freshly cut white lilies, their elegant trumpets still tightly furled, promising a fragrant bloom in the days to come. Every Friday, rain or shine, summer heat or winter's bite, Elias made this pilgrimage. It was a ritual as ingrained in the rhythm of his week as the rising and setting sun, a quiet conversation with the silence that had become his constant companion since Martha's passing. He knew the path by heart, each dip and rise, each gnarled root that threatened to trip the unwary. He could navigate it blindfolded, guided by the scent of pine needles and damp earth, the whisper of the wind through the aging stones, and the faint, almost imperceptible pull in his chest that always seemed to tug him towards one particular spot amidst the silent city of the dead. He passed the weathered markers of families long gone, names etched in stone faded by time and lichen, stories lost to the relentless march of years. He nodded to old Mrs. Abernathy's stone, a simple granite block overshadowed by a weeping willow, and tipped his imaginary hat to young Thomas Finley, whose marker, tragically new, still seemed too bright, too clean amongst the venerable grey of the older graves. Each stone held a memory, a whisper of a life lived, a story ending too soon, or a long chapter closed. As he rounded the bend in the path, the familiar grey granite of Martha's headstone came into view. His pace slowed, a familiar ache tightening in his chest. He could almost see her name, Martha-Elizabamy, even from this distance, the letters carved deep and bold, just like she had been bold and bright and full of life. He always paused here, at the edge of her space, taking a moment to compose himself, to gather the fragments of his heart that still scattered at the mere thought of her. He took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, tinged with the scent of decaying leaves and the promise of rain, and stepped forward. But then he stopped. He blinked, his eyes, though aged, still sharp enough to register the anomaly. Something was different. Something was wrong. At the foot of Martha's headstone, nestled amongst the meticulously raked pebbles he had placed there himself just last week, sat a bouquet of lilies. White lilies, just like the ones he carried, but already in full bloom, their creamy petals unfurled like silken banners, their pollen-dusted anthers a vibrant yellow against the stark white. The air around them was thick with their heady, almost intoxicating fragrance. Elias' hand, holding the bucket of his own lilies, froze midair. He stared, his brow furrowing, confusion knitting lines across his weathered forehead. Lilies, Martha's favorite. He knew that better than anyone. He had brought her lilies every week for years, even before she was laid to rest here. Lilies for birthdays, lilies for anniversaries, lilies just because. Lilies were their flower, a silent language spoken between two souls intertwined. But these lilies, these were not his. He hadn't placed them there. He was certain of it. He hadn't been here since last Friday, and he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that he had left her grave as he always did, clean, swept, and waiting for his offering. A ripple of unease, cold and unwelcome, spread through him. He lowered the bucket carefully to the ground, the metallic clang echoing too loudly in the afternoon stillness. He approached Martha's grave slowly, his gaze fixed on the unexpected bouquet. They were beautiful, undeniably so, perfectly formed, arranged with care, tied with a simple cream-colored ribbon. They looked expensive, certainly more extravagant than the simple bunches he usually brought from Mrs. Henderson's garden shop in town. He circled the grave slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. Had he missed someone? Was there another visitor? The cemetery was usually deserted on Friday afternoons. Most folks tended to come on Sundays after church to pay their respects. He saw no one, just the silent stones, the whispering trees, and the lengthening shadows. He knelt beside Martha's headstone, his knees creaking in protest, and reached out a hesitant hand towards the lilies. He touched a petal, soft and velvety, under his fingertip. They were indeed fresh, newly bloomed, their fragrance almost overpowering in its sweetness. He carefully lifted the bouquet, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It was heavier than it looked, the stems thick and lush. He examined the ribbon, a simple satin tie, neatly knotted. No card, no note, nothing to indicate who had placed them there. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him, confusion, bewilderment, and a prickle of something darker, something akin to violation. This was Martha's space, their space. This weekly ritual was his way of keeping her memory alive, of maintaining their connection across the veil of death. And now, someone else had intruded, had stepped into this sacred space, had placed their own offering on her grave. Tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps someone had got the graves mixed up. But Martha's grave wasn't easily mistaken. It was in a quiet corner of the cemetery, under the shade of a sprawling maple, slightly apart from the rows of newer stones. And the name, Martha Eliza Bellamy, was clearly etched for all to see. Besides lilies, it couldn't be a random choice. Surely, whoever had placed them, they must have known they were her favorite. But how? Who would know that, besides him, and their family, most of whom were long gone themselves? He thought of their daughter, Sarah, but Sarah lived miles away in Asheville. She visited Havenwood only a few times a year, usually around holidays, and she always called beforehand, letting him know when she was coming. It couldn't be Sarah. Besides, Sarah knew his Friday ritual. She wouldn't intrude on his time with Martha. He dismissed the thought immediately. It wasn't Sarah. It couldn't be. Then who? A well-meaning gesture, he told himself. That was the most likely explanation. Someone, perhaps a distant relative or an old acquaintance of Martha's, had remembered her, had wanted to pay their respects. Havenwood was a small town, after all. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of them. Perhaps someone had heard of Martha's passing, even years later, and had just now decided to visit her grave. It was a kind thought, a thoughtful gesture. He should be grateful, shouldn't he? He tried to force a smile, to convince himself that this was nothing more than a simple act of kindness. But the smile felt strained, unnatural. The unease lingered, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. It just felt wrong, too coincidental, too personal, lilies of all flowers. He carefully placed the bouquet back at the foot of the headstone, alongside his own bucket of lilies. He stepped back, studying the two arrangements side by side. His lilies, still furled and green, seemed almost insignificant next to the extravagant, fully bloomed bouquet. They looked out of place together, like two different languages spoken in the same breath. He knelt again, this time pulling out the small trowel and gardening gloves he always carried in his bucket. He began to tend to Martha's grave, weeding the stray blades of grass that had dared to sprout amongst the pebbles, smoothing the earth around the headstone. He worked slowly, deliberately, trying to distract himself from the nagging questions that swirled in his mind. Who had left the lilies? And why? And how did they know about Martha's favorite flower? As he worked, his gaze kept drifting back to the bouquet. He studied it again, searching for any clue, any hint of the giver's identity. He examined the ribbon again, turning it over in his gloved fingers. Plain cream satin, nothing remarkable. He sniffed the lilies again, their fragrance almost cloying now, too sweet, too intense. He noticed something then, something he hadn't seen before. Amongst the pristine white petals, tucked deep within the heart of one of the blooms, was a single, dried crimson rose petal. He frowned. A rose petal? Why a rose petal? It seemed deliberately placed, not just a stray petal that had fallen in accidentally. He carefully extracted it, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. It was brittle, almost crumbling to dust. Its color faded to a dull maroon. It looked old, very old. He turned it over and over, examining it closely. Was it significant? Did it mean something? Roses and lilies, they were often paired together in funeral arrangements, in expressions of love and remembrance. But the rose petal felt different somehow. It felt out of place, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. He tucked the dried petal into his pocket, a strange impulse driving him to keep it, to hold onto this small, insignificant piece of the puzzle. He finished weeding the grave, his movements his mind preoccupied with the lilies, the ribbon, the rose petal. He arranged his own lilies in a simple bunch, placing them carefully in his usual spot, near the base of the headstone. He stood back, surveying his work. Martha's grave looked neat and cared for, adorned with 2 bouquets of lilies, one extravagant and mysterious, the other simple and familiar. He felt a growing sense of unease, a disquiet that went beyond mere confusion. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since Martha's accident. A cold, creeping dread that whispered at the edges of his awareness, hinting at something unseen, something unknown, something unsettling. He glanced around the cemetery again, his eyes scanning the shadowed corners, the spaces between the stones, the dense trees that bordered the graveyard. The late afternoon sun had dipped further below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted in the fading light. The air seemed to grow colder, the silence deeper, more profound. He could almost hear the whispers of the wind in the trees, carrying secrets on their breath, murmuring tales of forgotten things. He shivered despite the mild temperature. It wasn't just the chill of the evening air. It was a deeper chill, a coldness that seeped into his bones, a feeling of being watched, of being observed by unseen eyes. He felt a sudden urge to leave, to get away from this place, to escape the unsettling presence that seemed to permeate the very stones of Havenwood Cemetery. He turned to leave, his steps quickening now, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. He didn't look back at Martha's grave, didn't want to see the 2 bouquets of lilies side by side, the mysterious offering and his own simple tribute. He just wanted to get home, to the familiar comfort of his old armchair, the warmth of his kerosene lamp, the silence of his empty house. As he hurried down the path, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The lilies, the rose petal, the silence of the cemetery, it all felt wrong, somehow disconnected from the ordinary rhythm of his life. It felt like a sign, a message, a whisper from the shadows, hinting at something hidden, something he couldn't quite grasp. He tried to dismiss it as the overactive imagination of an old man, the anxieties of a widower living alone in a town steeped in folklore and superstition. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step he took away from Martha's grave. He reached the cemetery gates, the wrought iron cold and heavy under his hand as he pushed them open. He stepped out onto the dusty road, the familiar landscape of Havenwood stretching out before him. The town, nestled in the valley below, seemed to huddle in the gathering dusk, its lights twinkling like scattered embers in the deepening twilight. He could see the smoke rising from the chimneys of the houses, smell the faint scent of wood smoke and cooking fires, the comforting aromas of everyday life. But even the familiar sights and smells of Havenwood couldn't completely dispel the unease that clung to him. The image of the lilies, so unexpected, so out of place, remained imprinted in his mind, a persistent question mark hanging over his thoughts. He quickened his pace, eager to reach the familiar sanctuary of his home, to shut the door against the gathering darkness, to escape the unsettling feeling that had taken root in his heart. He walked along the deserted road, the only sound the crunch of gravel under his boots and the distant murmur of the creek that ran alongside the road. He passed the old Miller place, its windows dark and vacant, the house slowly succumbing to the relentless embrace of the encroaching woods. He remembered the Millers, a large family, once vibrant and full of life, now scattered to the winds, their house a silent testament to the passing of time and the relentless changes that had slowly eroded the lifeblood of Havenwood. He thought of Martha, of their life together in this town, of the years they had shared, the joys and sorrows, the quiet routines and the unexpected adventures. He thought of her laughter, her gentle touch, her unwavering strength. He thought of her death, the sudden, shocking fall down the cellar stairs, the accident that had taken her from him so abruptly, so cruelly. The official verdict had been accidental death. A tragic accident, the coroner had said. A stumble, a misstep, a moment of carelessness. But even then, even in the immediate aftermath of his grief, a small seed of doubt had been planted in his mind. Martha had been sure-footed, always careful, especially on stairs. And the cellar stairs, they were old, uneven, dimly lit. But Martha knew them well. She had used them countless times, day in and day out, for years. It just didn't seem right. He had pushed the doubt aside, buried it deep beneath the weight of his grief, unwilling to question the official explanation, unable to face the possibility that something else, something darker, might have been at play. He had accepted the accident, had clung to the comfort of closure, however fragile. But now, standing here on the deserted road, with the image of the mysterious lily still fresh in his mind, the old doubts began to resurface, whispering insidious questions in his ear. The lilies, were they just a well-meaning gesture, or were they something more? A message, a sign, a reminder of something he had tried to forget. He reached his small, weathered cottage, nestled at the edge of the woods, a little further down the road from the cemetery. The kerosene lamp in the window cast a warm, inviting glow, a beacon in the gathering darkness. He hurried towards it, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of relief and apprehension churning within him. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it firmly behind him, shutting out the encroaching night, the unsettling silence of the cemetery, the nagging questions that haunted his mind. The familiar scent of his home, a comforting blend of wood smoke, old books, and dried herbs, washed over him, offering a temporary respite from the unease that had taken hold. He lit the lamp on the table, its soft yellow light chasing away the shadows that lurked in the corners of the room. He sank into his worn armchair, the familiar contours molding to his weary body. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart, to silence the insistent whispers in his mind. But the image of the lilies persisted, vivid and unsettling, and the dried rose petal, tucked safely in his pocket, felt like a heavy weight, a tangible reminder of the mystery that had suddenly intruded into his quiet, solitary life. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the petal, and held it up to the lamplight, studying its faded crimson color, its brittle texture. It was just a rose petal, he told himself. A dried, insignificant rose petal. It meant nothing. It was just a coincidence, just a random occurrence. He was letting his imagination run away with him. He was an old man, alone with his grief, prone to seeing shadows where there were none. But deep down, in the quiet recesses of his heart, he knew that it wasn't just his imagination. He knew that something was different. Something had shifted in the delicate balance of his world. The lilies, the rose petal, the unsettling feeling in the cemetery. It was all connected, somehow. It was a whisper from the past, a hint of a secret, a shadow of something unseen lurking just beneath the surface of the familiar world he thought he knew. And he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that he couldn't simply dismiss it. He couldn't ignore it. He had to find out who had left those lilies on Martha's grave. He had to unravel the mystery of the rose petal. He had to confront the unsettling feeling that had taken root in his heart, a feeling that whispered of forgotten secrets and a darkness that might be closer than he ever imagined. And as the evening deepened and the shadows lengthened in his small cottage, Elias knew that his quiet life, his peaceful routine, had been irrevocably disrupted. The lilies had bloomed on Martha's grave, and with them, a new chapter of uncertainty and unease had begun in the isolated town of Havenwood. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the tranquility of his grief had been shattered, replaced by a disquieting mystery that pulled him towards the shadows of the past, a past that Havenwood seemed determined to keep buried, but which now, with the unexpected appearance of those lilies, seemed to be stirring once more, reaching out from the grave into the fading light of day. The following Friday arrived, draped in a sky the color of bruised plums, heavy with the threat of an early autumn storm. Elias had spent the week in a state of quiet agitation, the image of the lilies blooming on Martha's grave replaying in his mind like a flickering lantern in the darkness. He had tried to focus on his routines, tending his small garden, mending his tools, reading his worn Bible by the kerosene lamp each evening. But the mystery of the flowers had woven itself into the fabric of his days, an unseen thread tugging at his thoughts, disrupting the familiar rhythm of his solitude. He had considered telling Sarah, his daughter, about the lilies, but a hesitant voice within him had held him back. What would he say? That someone was leaving flowers on Martha's grave. It sounded trivial, almost foolish when spoken aloud. Sarah had her own life in Asheville, her own worries. He didn't want to burden her with what might be nothing more than an overactive imagination in an old man. Besides, a part of him, a stubborn, fiercely private part, wanted to solve this himself. It was his mystery, his connection to Martha, and he felt a possessive need to understand it on his own terms. He had revisited the dried rose petal countless times, turning it over and over in his fingers, trying to decipher its silent message. He had even consulted his old botany book, a dusty tome filled with faded illustrations and Latin names, hoping to find some symbolic meaning associated with crimson rose petals and white lilies. But the book offered no clear answers, only vague allusions to love, loss, and remembrance, emotions that were already tangled within him. As Friday afternoon approached, a familiar knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. He prepared his usual offering, a bucket of freshly cut lilies from Mrs. Henderson's shop, their buds still tightly closed, promising a delayed bloom, a quiet echo of his own patient grief. He walked to the cemetery with a heavier step than usual, the gravel crunching under his boots sounding louder, more insistent in the unnerving stillness of the air. The sky pressed down, low and dark, and the wind, usually a comforting whisper through the trees, was strangely absent, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt thick and expectant. He followed the familiar path, his gaze fixed on the ground, his thoughts a tangled thicket of questions and anxieties. He rounded the bend, and Martha's grave came into view. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. They were there. At the foot of Martha's headstone, nestled amongst the pebbles, was another bouquet of lilies, identical to the first, white, fully bloomed, tied with the same cream-colored satin ribbon. The air was thick with their heady fragrance, almost suffocating in its sweetness. They looked impossibly fresh, as if they had just been placed there, their petals unblemished, their stamens dusted with vibrant yellow pollen. Elias stood frozen, his bucket of lilies dangling forgotten in his hand. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. They were back. Again. The unease he had felt last week solidified into a cold certainty. This was no random act of kindness. This was something deliberate, something purposeful. He approached the grave slowly, circling it as he had done before, his eyes scanning the surrounding area, searching for any sign, any clue. The cemetery was deserted, shrouded in the gathering gloom of the impending storm. The ancient stones stood silent sentinel, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the fading light. He saw no one. He heard nothing but the frantic beating of his own heart. He knelt beside Martha's grave, the damp earth chilling his knees through his worn trousers. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and touched a petal of the new bouquet, soft, cool, impossibly perfect. He lifted the bouquet, feeling the familiar weight of it in his hand. He examined the ribbon, the simple satin tie, the neat knot. No card, no note, nothing to identify the giver. He felt a surge of something akin to anger, a protective fury rising within him. This was an intrusion, a violation of Martha's memory of their private space. Who was doing this, and why? The questions hammered at his mind, demanding answers, fueling a growing sense of frustration and a prickle of fear. He placed his own lilies, still tightly furled and unassuming, beside the extravagant bouquet. The contrast was even starker this week. His humble offering looked almost pathetic next to the perfect, fully bloomed lilies. It felt like a deliberate statement, a challenge, a mocking echo of his own simple devotion. He needed to know. He couldn't dismiss it anymore. He couldn't rationalize it away as a well-meaning gesture. This was something more, something unsettling. He stood up, his knees creaking in protest, and looked around the cemetery. His gaze fell on a figure in the distance, moving slowly amongst the rows of stones. Silas, the cemetery groundskeeper, a man as weathered and taciturn as the ancient stones he tended. Silas had been the groundskeeper for as long as Elias could remember, a fixture in Havenwood Cemetery, as much a part of the landscape as the oaks and the headstones. He was a man of few words, his face etched with the lines of time and unspoken stories, his eyes holding a deep, unreadable knowledge of the cemetery and its secrets. Elias made his way towards Silas, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Silas was bent over a grave, weeding with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't look up as Elias approached, his gaze fixed on the task at hand. "Silas," Elias said, his voice rough with a week's worth of unspoken anxieties. Silas straightened slowly, turning to face Elias, his movements stiff and deliberate, like an old tree creaking in the wind. His eyes, the color of faded denim, regarded Elias with a steady, unblinking gaze. They held no warmth, no welcome, but no hostility either. Just a quiet, watchful neutrality. "Elias," Silas acknowledged, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting in a riverbed. It was not a question, not a greeting, just a simple recognition of his presence. "Silas, I wanted to ask you something," Elias began, his voice hesitant, unsure how to phrase the strange question that weighed on his mind. He gestured back towards Martha's grave, visible in the distance. Have you seen anyone else visiting Martha's grave lately?" Silas followed Elias' gaze, his eyes settling on Martha's headstone. He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Elias waited, the silence stretching taut between them, punctuated only by the distant caw of a crow and the rustle of leaves in the ancient oaks. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice low and measured. "Visitors come and go, Elias. This is a place for remembrance." "Yes, but these flowers," Elias persisted, stepping closer to Silas, lowering his voice as if afraid of being overheard by the silent stones. "These lilies, they weren't there last week when I came, and then they were, and now they're here again." Silas remained impassive, his face a mask of weathered stone. "Flowers grow, Elias. People bring flowers. But not like this, Silas," Elias pressed on, his voice urgent. "Not lilies, not like these. They're too perfect, too extravagant, and they weren't there last week. I know I would have seen them." Silas shifted his weight, his gaze drifting away from Martha's grave, towards the darkening sky. "Things happen in the cemetery, Elias. Things we don't always understand." Elias frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, Silas?" Silas was silent for another long moment, his gaze lost in the swirling clouds above. Then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper, as if confiding a secret to the ancient stones themselves. "This is old ground, Elias. Very old. Many things have been buried here, besides the dead." Elias felt a chill run down his spine, despite the mild temperature. Silas's words were cryptic, unsettling. He sensed a deeper meaning hidden beneath the surface of his taciturn pronouncements. "What kind of things, Silas?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible. Silas turned his gaze back to Elias, his eyes holding a flicker of something unreadable, something that might have been warning, or perhaps just a reflection of the gathering gloom. "Stories, Elias, secrets, things best left undisturbed." He paused, then added, his voice even lower, almost a murmur. "Some say the cemetery, it remembers, it sees things, things we living folk forget." Elias stared at Silas, his mind reeling. The groundskeeper's words were strange, unsettling, echoing the whispers of folklore that clung to Havenwood like mist to the mountains. He had always dismissed such tales as old wives' fables, superstitions clinging to the edges of reason. But now, standing here in the gathering gloom, listening to Silas's cryptic pronouncements, a seed of doubt began to sprout in his mind. Could there be more to the cemetery than just a resting place for the dead? Could it hold secrets, memories, something else? "Have you seen anyone leaving these lilies, Silas?" Elias asked again, his voice more insistent now. "Anyone unusual?" Silas shook his head slowly, his gaze drifting across the rows of graves. "I see many things, Elias, but I don't always see everything. The cemetery, it has its own shadows, places where things can hide, places where things can be unseen." He paused again, then added, his voice a low rumble. "And sometimes, Elias, things appear that weren't there before." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any further explanation. He simply turned back to his weeding, his silence closing around him like a shroud. Elias stood for a moment, watching Silas, his mind churning with confusion and unease. Silas wasn't offering answers, but he wasn't dismissing the mystery either. He was hinting at something strange and unsettling connected to the cemetery itself. Elias knew he wouldn't get anything more from Silas. The groundskeeper was a closed book, his knowledge guarded, his secrets buried deep within the weathered landscape of his soul. But their brief conversation had shifted something within Elias. It had confirmed his unease, validated his sense that something was amiss, something beyond a simple act of kindness. He thanked Silas with a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the cryptic exchange, and turned back towards Martha's grave. The sky was darkening rapidly now, the first fat drops of rain beginning to fall, spattering on the stones and the leaves of the ancient oaks. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the scent of damp earth and approaching storm. He looked at the 2 bouquets of lilies at the foot of Martha's headstone, his simple offering and the extravagant, mysterious bouquet. He knew he couldn't just leave it at that. He couldn't just keep coming back each week, finding the lilies, and remain in the dark. He needed to know who was leaving them. He needed to understand why. He needed to unravel the mystery that had taken root in Martha's grave and in his own heart. He thought of Silas's words, "Things appear that weren't there before," and places where things can be unseen. An idea began to form in his mind, a plan, however rudimentary, to shed some light on the mystery. He needed to watch. He needed to see who was coming to Martha's grave, who was leaving these lilies. But he couldn't simply stand watch, not in his old body, not in the shadows of the cemetery. He needed a way to observe, to record, to capture the unseen. He thought of his old birdhouse, the one he had built for Martha years ago, a whimsical little structure with a shingled roof and a tiny porch. It had sat in their garden for years, a silent witness to their lives, a haven for generations of wrens and sparrows. He had taken it down after Martha's passing, stored it in the shed, a forgotten relic of a brighter time. An idea sparked in his mind. He could adapt the birdhouse. He could disguise something within it, something that could watch, something that could record. He remembered seeing a small motion-activated camera in the hardware store in town, advertised for home security. It was small, discreet, battery-powered. It could be hidden inside the birdhouse, its lens peeking out from a small opening, its motion sensor triggered by anyone approaching Martha's grave. It was a long shot, he knew, but it was a start. It was a way to take action, to reclaim some control in the face of the unsettling mystery. He would install the birdhouse near Martha's grave. He would camouflage it amongst the branches of the old maple tree, making it look like just another birdhouse, a harmless addition to the cemetery landscape. But inside, hidden from view, the camera would watch, waiting, recording. He made up his mind. He would do it. He would install the camera. He would see who was leaving the lilies. He would unravel the mystery of Martha's grave. He gathered his bucket of lilies, his own simple offering, and placed them carefully at the foot of the headstone, alongside the extravagant bouquet. He lingered for a moment longer, his hand resting on the cool granite of Martha's name, a silent promise passing between him and the stone. He would find out. He would uncover the truth. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Martha's grave bathed in the gathering gloom, the 2 bouquets of lilies blooming side by side, silent sentinels guarding a secret yet to be revealed. He walked with a renewed sense of purpose, the rain now falling steadily, washing away the dust from the gravel path, but not the questions from his mind. He was no longer just a grieving widower, making his weekly pilgrimage to the cemetery. He was an investigator, a seeker of truth, drawn into a mystery that had bloomed unexpectedly, like the lilies on Martha's grave, in the heart of Havenwood Cemetery. And as he walked away into the deepening shadows of the storm, he knew that his quiet life had irrevocably changed. The lilies had awakened something, stirred something long dormant in the silent town of Havenwood. And he, Elias, was now caught in its unfolding, drawn deeper into the shadows, towards an unknown destination, guided only by the fragile hope of understanding and the unwavering memory of Martha. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the answer to the mystery lay within the cemetery grounds, hidden amongst the ancient stones and the whispering trees, waiting to be unearthed, waiting to be seen. And he would be there, with his disguised birdhouse and his motion-activated camera, waiting to see what the shadows would reveal. The storm broke over Havenwood that night, unleashing a torrent of rain that hammered against Elias' cottage roof and rattled the window panes. The wind howled through the trees surrounding his property, a mournful symphony that echoed the turmoil in his own heart. He spent the evening preparing the birdhouse, his movements deliberate and focused, a way to channel his anxiety into practical action. He retrieved the old wooden structure from the shed, its once bright paint faded and peeling, its tiny porch weathered and worn. He cleaned it out, removing the accumulated dust and cobwebs, the remnants of forgotten nests. The motion-activated camera was smaller than he expected, a compact black box with a tiny lens and a slot for a memory card. He had purchased it that afternoon at the hardware store, explaining to a young, slightly bewildered clerk that he needed it to monitor a problem with squirrels in his garden. The clerk, more interested in his phone than in Elias' explanation, had simply nodded and rung up the sale. Elias had also bought a small, lockable metal box, designed for storing valuables, its purpose now repurposed to protect the camera from the elements and prying eyes. Back in his cottage, he carefully dismantled the birdhouse roof, creating a hidden compartment within the structure. He lined the compartment with soft cloth to cushion the camera and drilled a small, discreet hole in the front of the birdhouse, just below the perch, for the lens to peer through. He secured the metal box inside the compartment, ensuring it was firmly in place and wouldn't shift during handling. He tested the camera, reading the brief instructions, setting the motion detection sensitivity to medium, and inserting a fresh set of batteries. He practiced positioning the camera within the box, adjusting the angle until the lens captured a wide field of view, encompassing Martha's grave and the surrounding area. As he worked, the storm raged outside, the wind buffeting the cottage, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm against the roof. The sounds of the storm seemed to amplify his sense of unease, a feeling of being caught in forces larger than himself, swept along by currents he didn't understand. He thought of Silas's words, "Things happen in the cemetery, things we don't always understand." And some say the cemetery, it remembers. The groundskeeper's cryptic pronouncements resonated with a strange, unsettling truth in the storm-lashed darkness. By the time he finished modifying the birdhouse, it was late. The storm showed no signs of abating, the wind still howling, the rain still falling in sheets. He placed the birdhouse carefully on the table, admiring his handiwork. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary, slightly weathered birdhouse, innocuous and unremarkable. But hidden within its wooden frame, a silent observer was ready to watch, to record, to capture the unseen. He ate a meager supper of bread and cheese, washed down with a cup of lukewarm tea. He felt tired but restless, his mind still racing with questions and anxieties. He knew he wouldn't sleep well that night. The storm, the lilies, the mystery of Martha's grave, it all swirled within him, a vortex of unease and unanswered questions. He sat in his armchair by the kerosene lamp, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He picked up his worn Bible, but his eyes couldn't focus on the familiar words. His thoughts kept drifting back to the cemetery, to Martha's grave, to the mysterious bouquet of lilies. He wondered if they would be there again next Friday. He wondered who was leaving them. He wondered what Silas meant by secrets and things best left undisturbed. He closed the Bible, placing it on the small table beside his chair. He leaned back, closing his eyes, trying to clear his mind, to find a moment of peace amidst the storm within and without. But the image of the lilies persisted, vivid and unsettling, blooming in the darkness of his thoughts. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the storm having moved on, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping wet. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Elias woke early, his sleep fitful and fragmented. He felt a sense of urgency, a need to put his plan into action. He ate a quick breakfast, dressed in his worn work clothes, and carefully packed the modified birdhouse, the motion-activated camera securely nestled within, into his old canvas bag. He added a small stepladder, a screwdriver, and a roll of heavy-duty tape. He checked the camera one last time, ensuring it was switched on and recording. He walked to the cemetery under the leaden sky, the gravel crunching softly under his boots. The air was still and silent, the aftermath of the storm creating a sense of hushed expectancy. The cemetery looked different in the aftermath of the rain, the stones glistening wetly, the trees dripping moisture, the earth dark and saturated. The lilies on Martha's grave, however, looked impossibly pristine, their white petals gleaming against the gray backdrop, their fragrance even more potent in the damp air. He approached Martha's grave, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He looked around, scanning the cemetery. It was deserted. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the trees and the distant call of a bird. He placed his canvas bag on the ground beside Martha's headstone and surveyed the area. The old maple tree that shaded Martha's grave was the perfect location for the birdhouse. Its branches were thick and sturdy, providing ample cover and a clear view of the grave. He selected a branch, high enough to be out of reach, but low enough to be accessible with the stepladder. He unfolded the stepladder and carefully positioned it beneath the chosen branch. He took the birdhouse from his bag and climbed the ladder, the wooden rungs creaking under his weight. He reached the branch, carefully positioning the birdhouse amongst the leaves, using the heavy-duty tape to secure it firmly in place. He adjusted the angle, ensuring the camera lens had a clear view of Martha's grave. He descended the ladder, retrieved his tools, and stepped back to survey his work. The birdhouse looked perfectly natural amongst the branches of the maple tree, blending seamlessly into the cemetery landscape. Unless someone knew to look for it, it would be completely unnoticed. He felt a small sense of satisfaction, a feeling of having taken a step forward, of having initiated a plan to unravel the mystery. He left the cemetery, walking with a lighter step than he had arrived. He knew he had to wait. He had to give the camera time to record. He decided he would return in a week, the following Friday, to retrieve the camera and review the footage. A week felt like a long time, an eternity of waiting and uncertainty. But he knew he had to be patient. He had set the wheels in motion. Now he had to let them turn. The week that followed was a blur of anxious anticipation. Elias tried to maintain his routines, to occupy his mind with familiar tasks. He worked in his garden, weeding and tending his vegetables. He read his Bible, seeking solace in the familiar words. He visited Mrs. Henderson at the garden shop, buying his usual lilies for Martha, keeping up the pretense of his weekly ritual, even though his focus had shifted, his purpose now intertwined with the hidden camera and the unanswered questions. But beneath the surface of his routines, his mind was constantly preoccupied with the cemetery, with the birdhouse, with the unseen observer recording the silent dramas of Martha's grave. He imagined the camera capturing the mysterious visitor, the person who was leaving the lilies. He pictured faces, scenarios, possible explanations, his imagination running wild with speculation. Friday arrived, mirroring the previous Friday with a heavy, overcast sky, a sense of impending storm hanging in the air. Elias felt a knot of nervous anticipation tightening in his stomach as he walked to the cemetery. This was the day. The day he would retrieve the camera, the day he would finally see who was leaving the lilies. He hoped. He prayed that the camera had captured something, anything that would shed light on the mystery. He reached Martha's grave, his heart pounding in his chest. The lilies were there again, as expected, white and fully bloomed, their fragrance heavy in the damp air. He ignored them for the moment, his focus fixed on the birdhouse nestled amongst the branches of the maple tree. It looked undisturbed, just as he had left it. He unfolded the stepladder and carefully climbed up to the branch, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the birdhouse. He detached it from the branch, gently lowering it into his canvas bag. He descended the ladder, his heart racing, his hands clammy with sweat. He retreated to a secluded corner of the cemetery, behind a cluster of ancient yews, out of sight of the main path. He took the birdhouse from his bag and carefully opened the hidden compartment. He retrieved the metal box, unlocked it, and extracted the motion-activated camera. He switched it off, removed the memory card, and placed it carefully in a small plastic case he had brought for that purpose. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The moment of truth had arrived. The memory card held the answers, or perhaps it held nothing. Perhaps the camera had failed, or perhaps no one had visited Martha's grave except him. He tried to temper his expectations, to prepare himself for disappointment. He hurried home, his canvas bag clutched tightly in his hand, the memory card feeling like a precious, fragile artifact. Back in his cottage, he placed the memory card into his old laptop, a relic from a time when Sarah had tried to convince him to embrace the digital age. He rarely used it now, but it still functioned, a dusty window into a world he barely understood. He opened the File Explorer and navigated to the memory card. He saw a series of video files, dated and timed. His heart skipped a beat. The camera had worked. It had recorded something. He clicked on the first file, his hand trembling slightly as he moved the mouse. The video player opened, the screen flickering to life. The image was grainy, black and white, captured in the low light of the cemetery. It was a view of Martha's grave, framed by the branches of the maple tree. The camera angle was perfect. He fast-forwarded through the initial footage, watching hours of empty cemetery, the wind rustling the leaves, the shadows shifting in the changing light. Nothing, just the silent stones and the whispering trees. He felt a pang of disappointment. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps no one had visited Martha's grave. Perhaps the lilies were just a strange coincidence, a trick of the light, a figment of his overactive imagination. He continued watching, his gaze fixed on the screen, his hope dwindling with each passing minute of empty footage. Then, as he was about to give up, to dismiss the whole thing as a foolish endeavor, something shifted on the screen. Movement. A figure entering the frame, approaching Martha's grave. His breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes straining to see through the grainy black and white image. The figure was indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but it was definitely a person. They were carrying something white. As the figure moved closer to Martha's grave, Elias' heart began to pound again, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He watched, mesmerized, as the figure knelt at the foot of the headstone and placed the white object on the grave. Lilies. It was the lilies. He watched as the figure lingered for a moment, head bowed, as if in silent prayer or remembrance. Then they stood up and turned to leave, walking back the way they had come, disappearing into the shadows of the cemetery. The video ended. Elias sat frozen, staring at the blank screen, his mind reeling. He had seen it. He had proof. Someone was leaving the lilies on Martha's grave. But who? He replayed the video again and again, focusing on the figure, trying to discern any detail, any identifying feature. But the image was too grainy, too indistinct. The figure was shrouded in shadow, their face obscured, their clothing dark and shapeless. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, young or old. It was just a shadowy figure, appearing out of the darkness, leaving lilies on Martha's grave, and then vanishing back into the shadows. He felt a surge of frustration. He had come so close, yet he was still no closer to understanding the mystery. The video had confirmed his unease, validated his sense that something strange was happening. But it had offered no answers, no clues to the identity of the mysterious visitor. He scrolled through the remaining video files, hoping for a clearer image, a different angle, anything that would reveal more. He clicked on the next file, and the screen flickered to life again. This time, the footage was from a different night. He fast-forwarded, watching more hours of empty cemetery, the wind, the shadows, the silent stones. Then it happened again. Movement. A figure entering the frame, approaching Martha's grave. His heart began to pound again, the same frantic drumbeat. He watched, his gaze fixed on the screen, as the figure knelt at the foot of the headstone and placed the white object on the grave. Lilies. Again. He replayed this video, and then another and another. Each video showed the same scene, the same shadowy figure appearing in the darkness, placing lilies on Martha's grave, and then vanishing back into the shadows. It was always the same, always lilies, always at night, always the same shadowy figure. He felt a growing sense of bewilderment, a deepening unease. Who was this person? Why were they leaving lilies on Martha's grave? And why always at night, shrouded in secrecy? It made no sense. It felt unsettling, almost sinister. He decided to review all the footage from the beginning, slowly, carefully, frame by frame, searching for any detail he might have missed. He went back to the first video, the one that had captured the figure for the first time. He played it again, this time in slow motion, pausing and rewinding, scrutinizing every frame. He watched as the shadowy figure approached Martha's grave, their movements slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. He focused on their clothing, trying to discern any detail, any clue. Dark, shapeless, blending into the shadows. Then something caught his eye. Something about the way the figure moved. Something familiar. He paused the video, rewinding slightly, focusing on a particular moment, a particular movement. The way the figure's arms swung as they knelt down. The way they tilted their head as they placed the lilies on the grave. The way they stood up, their posture slightly stooped, the gait slow and deliberate as they turned to leave. A cold dread began to creep into his heart, a chilling sense of recognition. He knew that movement, he knew that posture, he knew that gait. He had seen it countless times. He saw it every day when he looked in the mirror. He replayed the video again, his eyes fixed on the shadowy figure, his mind racing, his heart pounding with a terrifying realization. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the more he watched, the more certain he became. The shadowy figure in the video, it looked like him. He dismissed the thought immediately. It was ridiculous. It was his imagination running wild, fueled by anxiety and sleepless nights. It couldn't be him. He hadn't been to the cemetery at night. Not in years. Not since Martha. But the image on the screen persisted, the shadowy figure hauntingly familiar. He replayed another video, and another, focusing on the movements, the posture, the gait. Each time, the same chilling sense of recognition. Each time, the growing certainty that he was looking at himself. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He paused the video, his hand trembling as he reached for the mouse. He needed to see more. He needed to be sure. He scrolled through the video files, searching for the most recent footage, the video from last Friday night, the night before he had found the lilies on Martha's grave. He found the file, dated and timed for last Friday night. He clicked on it, his breath catching in his throat. The screen flickered to life again, the grainy black and white image of Martha's grave appearing before him. He fast-forwarded, his eyes fixed on the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw it, the figure entering the frame, approaching Martha's grave. He watched, his breath held captive in his lungs, as the figure knelt down and placed the white object on the grave. Lilies. Again. This time he focused not just on the movements, but on the clothing. The figure was wearing something light-colored, loose-fitting, something that looked familiar. He strained his eyes, trying to make out the details in the grainy black and white image. Then he saw it, the distinct pattern of the fabric, the faint outline of the collar, the unmistakable shape of the garment. He recognized it. He knew that garment. He wore it every night. It was his sleepwear. His old, worn flannel pajamas, the ones Martha had given him years ago, the ones he still wore every night, a silent comfort in the emptiness of his bed. He stared at the screen, his blood running cold, his mind reeling in disbelief. The shadowy figure in the video, the figure leaving lilies on Martha's grave in the dead of night, wearing his sleepwear, it was him. It was undeniably, horrifyingly him. He replayed the video again, and again, focusing on the clothing, the movements, the posture. Each time, the same terrifying confirmation. It was him. He was the one leaving the lilies. He was the mysterious visitor. But it made no sense. It was impossible. He hadn't been to the cemetery at night. He lived 50 miles away now, in that small apartment in Asheville, closer to Sarah. He hadn't driven his old truck in months, not since he had moved out of the cottage. He had no memory of any of this, no recollection of driving back to Havenwood, of going to the cemetery at night, of placing lilies on Martha's grave. He felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of disorientation, as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. His sanity, the fragile framework of his reality, began to crumble around him. He was seeing things. He was imagining things. He was losing his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the images on the screen, the horrifying reality of what he had just witnessed. He took deep breaths, trying to calm his racing heart, to steady his trembling hands. But the images persisted, burned into his mind, the shadowy figure in his sleepwear, placing lilies on Martha's grave in the dead of night. He opened his eyes, his gaze falling on the laptop screen, the paused video still displayed, the shadowy figure frozen in time, a silent accusation staring back at him. He felt a cold dread seeping into his bones, a chilling certainty that something was terribly wrong. He was the one leaving the lilies, but he didn't know why. He didn't remember doing it. He was a stranger to himself, a ghost in his own life, acting out a ritual he didn't understand, driven by forces he couldn't comprehend. He was losing his grip on reality, sliding into a darkness that threatened to consume him, a darkness as deep and impenetrable as the shadows of Havenwood Cemetery at night. And as the reality of his discovery settled upon him, heavy and suffocating, Elias knew that the mystery of the lilies was no longer just about Martha's grave. It was about him. It was about his own fragmented memory, his own unraveling sanity, his own terrifying descent into the unknown depths of his own mind. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the answers he sought were not just buried in Havenwood Cemetery, but buried within himself, hidden in the shadows of his forgotten nights, waiting to be unearthed, waiting to be confronted. His quiet grief had transformed into a terrifying self-discovery, and the simple act of placing flowers on a grave had become a horrifying question mark hanging over his very existence. The revelation hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for breath in the still air of his cottage. He replayed the video again, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear and disbelief, each frame etching the horrifying truth deeper into his consciousness. The shadowy figure, the familiar gait, the worn flannel pajamas, it was undeniably him. He, Elias, was the one haunting Martha's grave, leaving lilies in the dead of night. But how? Why? His mind recoiled from the impossible reality, grasping at straws of denial. Sleepwalking. Could it be sleepwalking? He had heard stories, whispers in Havenwood about folks doing strange things in their sleep, wandering miles in the dead of night, acting out forgotten rituals, driven by unseen forces. But he had always dismissed them as folklore, old wives' tales, superstitions clinging to the edges of reason. Now the folklore seemed to be reaching out, tangling itself in his own life, weaving a terrifying thread through the fabric of his sanity. He remembered Silas's cryptic words. Things happen in the cemetery, things we don't always understand. And some say the cemetery, it remembers. Could the cemetery be somehow influencing him? Could Martha's grave be calling him, drawing him back to Havenwood in his sleep, compelling him to perform this strange, unsettling ritual? The thought was absurd, fantastical, yet in the face of the video evidence, nothing seemed impossible anymore. He spent the rest of the day in a daze of disorientation, moving through his cottage like a ghost, his mind trapped in a loop of disbelief and fear. He couldn't eat, couldn't read, couldn't even find solace in the familiar silence of his home. The image of the shadowy figure, his shadowy figure, haunted him relentlessly, a mocking specter of his own unraveling mind. By evening, the fear had solidified into a desperate need for answers, for some semblance of rational explanation. He knew he couldn't ignore this. He couldn't dismiss it as a nightmare, a hallucination. The video was real. The lilies were real. And his nocturnal visits to the cemetery were real, however inexplicable they seemed. He thought of Dr. Albright, the town's only physician, a man as weathered and pragmatic as the mountains themselves. Doctor. Albright had seen it all in Havenwood, from mining accidents to mysterious ailments, from broken bones to broken hearts. If anyone could offer a rational explanation, a medical perspective, it would be Dr. Albright. The next morning, Elias drove his old truck into town, the familiar route feeling strangely alien, the landscape of Havenwood seeming to press in on him, heavy with unspoken secrets. He parked outside Dr. Albright's small, unassuming office, the white paint peeling slightly, the sign above the door faded by years of sun and rain. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling faintly, announcing his arrival. The waiting room was empty, save for a few worn magazines scattered on a small table and the faint, antiseptic smell of disinfectant. Mrs. Gable, Dr. Albright's receptionist, a woman whose face seemed permanently etched with a kind, weary patience, looked up from her desk as Elias approached. "Elias," she said, her voice gentle, a familiar comfort in the swirling unease that gripped him. "What brings you in today?" "I need to see the doctor, Mrs. Gable," Elias said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "It's important." Mrs. Gable's brow furrowed slightly, her kind eyes searching his face. "Are you feeling unwell, Elias?" "Yes," Elias said, the word feeling inadequate, a vast understatement of the turmoil within him. "Yes, I'm not well." Mrs. Gable nodded slowly, her gaze softening with concern. "Dr. Albright is free at the moment. Go right on in, Elias." Elias thanked her and walked down the short hallway to Dr. Albright's office, the familiar scent of medicine and old paper filling his nostrils. He hesitated for a moment before knocking softly on the open doorframe. "Come in, Elias," Dr. Albright's voice rumbled, warm and reassuring, like a familiar hand on his shoulder. Elias stepped into the office, the small room cluttered with medical charts, anatomical models, and stacks of medical journals. Doctor. Albright sat behind his large wooden desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his gaze sharp and intelligent behind the thick lenses. He looked up as Elias entered, his expression shifting from professional detachment to concerned recognition. "Elias, good to see you," Dr. Albright said, removing his glasses and placing them on the desk. "Though you don't look entirely well. What's troubling you?" Elias sat down in the chair opposite the desk, the worn leather creaking under his weight. He hesitated, unsure how to begin, how to articulate the bizarre, unsettling truth he had discovered. "Doctor," Elias began, his voice trembling slightly, I think something strange is happening to me." Dr. Albright leaned forward, his gaze intent, his expression encouraging. "Tell me about it, Elias. I'm listening." Elias took a deep breath, gathering his courage, and began to explain. He told Dr. Albright about the lilies on Martha's grave, about his confusion and unease, about setting up the camera, and about the horrifying discovery he had made that he was the one leaving the flowers. He described the video footage, the shadowy figure in his sleepwear, the chilling sense of recognition, the complete lack of memory. Dr. Albright listened patiently, his expression remaining neutral, his gaze unwavering. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss Elias' story as the ramblings of an old man. He simply listened, absorbing every detail, his mind working, piecing together the fragmented narrative. When Elias finished, the silence in the office hung heavy, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. "Doctor." Albright leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "Sleepwalking," Dr. Albright said finally, his voice measured, thoughtful. "It sounds like a classic case of somnambulism, Elias. Sleepwalking." Elias stared at Dr. Albright, relief and a flicker of skepticism warring within him. Sleepwalking. It sounded almost mundane compared to the unsettling mystery that had consumed him. But Dr. Albright's calm, rational pronouncement offered a glimmer of hope, a possibility of a logical explanation. "Sleepwalking," Elias repeated, his voice still hesitant. "But lilies, the cemetery, miles away." Dr. Albright nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Sleepwalking can manifest in many ways, Elias. It can be triggered by stress, anxiety, grief, all of which you've been experiencing, especially with the anniversary of Martha's passing. And it can involve complex behaviors, actions that seem purposeful, even ritualistic. Driving, walking long distances, performing tasks, it's all within the realm of possibility." "But I don't remember any of it," Elias protested, his voice laced with doubt. "Not a thing. It's like those nights are just gone." "That's common with sleepwalking," Dr. Albright explained. "Amnesia is a hallmark of somnambulism. The brain is in a different state of consciousness. The memories aren't properly encoded. You're essentially acting on autopilot, driven by subconscious impulses, anxieties, memories, in your case, perhaps deeply rooted grief, and a subconscious need to honor Martha's memory." Dr. Albright paused, then continued, his voice gentle but firm. "The lilies, the cemetery, it all fits, Elias. Martha's favorite flower, her final resting place. Your subconscious is taking you there, driving you to perform this ritual of remembrance, this act of love and grief in your sleep." Elias listened, his skepticism slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance. Dr. Albright's explanation, while still unsettling, offered a framework of rationality, a way to understand the bizarre events that had been plaguing him. Sleepwalking. It was still strange, still unsettling, but it was explainable, medical, not supernatural. "So, what can be done, Doctor?" Elias asked, his voice laced with a fragile hope. "Can it be stopped?" "Yes, Elias, it can be managed," Dr. Albright said, nodding reassuringly. "There are medications we can try. Benzodiazepines, antidepressants, they can help regulate sleep cycles, reduce anxiety, and often diminish or eliminate sleepwalking episodes. We can start with a low dose and see how you respond." Dr. Albright reached for his prescription pad, his pen poised above the blank sheet. "I'm going to prescribe you a mild benzodiazepine, diazepam. It should help calm your anxieties and regulate your sleep. Take 1 tablet before bed each night, and we'll monitor your progress. If it doesn't help, we can adjust the dosage or try a different medication. He wrote out the prescription, tore it from the pad, and handed it to Elias. Give this to Mrs. Gable. She'll get it filled for you. And come back and see me in a week, Elias. Let me know how you're feeling if you notice any changes. Elias took the prescription, a small piece of paper representing a fragile hope for a return to normalcy, a chance to reclaim his sanity, to silence the shadowy figure that haunted his nights. He thanked Dr. Albright, a wave of relief washing over him, a sense of having taken a first step towards understanding, towards healing. He collected his medication from Mrs. Gable, the small bottle of pills feeling heavy in his pocket, a tangible promise of respite. He drove back to his cottage, the landscape of Havenwood seeming less oppressive now, the shadows less menacing, sleepwalking. It was a diagnosis, a medical condition, not a descent into madness. He could manage it. He could control it. He could reclaim his nights, his memories, his life. That night, Elias took the diazepam tablet before bed, the small white pill feeling like a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. He lay in bed, waiting for sleep to come, his mind calmer than it had been in weeks, the anxieties and fears momentarily subdued by the promise of medication, by the rational explanation offered by Dr. Albright. He drifted off to sleep, a fragile sense of peace settling over him. But the peace was short-lived. Friday arrived, draped in the same ominous grey sky as the previous weeks, the air heavy with a familiar sense of foreboding. Elias had taken the diazepam every night that week, faithfully following Dr. Albright's instructions. He had felt, calmer perhaps, less agitated during the day, but the underlying unease, the nagging sense of something amiss, had persisted. He walked to the cemetery that Friday afternoon, his usual bucket of lilies in hand, a renewed sense of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He had hoped, desperately, that the medication would work, that the nocturnal visits would stop, that the mystery of the lilies would be resolved. But a part of him, a deep, unsettling intuition, whispered that it was not so simple, that the diazepam, a small white pill, was no match for the forces, whatever they were, that were driving him to Martha's grave in the dead of night. He rounded the bend in the path, Martha's grave coming into view, his breath catching in his throat. They were there. Again. At the foot of Martha's headstone, nestled amongst the pebbles, another bouquet of lilies, white and fully bloomed, tied with the same cream-colored satin ribbon. The air was thick with their cloying fragrance, a sweet, suffocating reminder of the mystery that refused to be solved, the unsettling ritual that persisted despite the medication, despite the rational explanations, despite his desperate hope for normalcy. The diazepam had failed. The sleepwalking, if that was truly what it was, continued unabated. The shadowy figure still haunted Martha's grave, leaving lilies in the darkness, driven by forces beyond his conscious control, beyond the reach of medical intervention. Despair washed over Elias, a cold wave of hopelessness threatening to engulf him. He sank to his knees beside Martha's grave, the bucket of lilies falling forgotten to the ground, the metallic clang echoing too loudly in the oppressive silence. He stared at the lilies, the mysterious bouquet, and his own humble offering side by side, a stark contrast of the known and the unknown, the rational and the inexplicable. He felt utterly lost, adrift in a sea of confusion and fear, the fragile hope offered by Dr. Albright shattered, the rational explanations proving inadequate, the medical intervention failing to penetrate the deeper mystery that clung to Martha's grave, that clung to him. That night the nightmares began. They started subtly at first, vague and indistinct, fleeting images at the edges of sleep, shadows moving in the periphery of his vision, whispers carried on the wind. But they grew stronger, more vivid, more terrifying with each passing night, invading his sleep, stealing his rest, plunging him into a world of darkness and dread. He dreamt of Martha, but not the Martha he remembered, the vibrant, loving woman who had filled his life with light. This Martha was pale, ethereal, her eyes hollow and dark, her voice a whisper carried on the wind, calling his name, beckoning him towards the cemetery, towards the darkness that lay beyond the veil of sleep. And then there was the figure. A dark figure, lurking in the shadows of Havenwood Cemetery, amidst the ancient stones and the whispering trees. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by shadow, its presence radiating a cold, malevolent energy that seeped into his bones, filling him with a primal fear that transcended reason, that echoed something ancient and deeply buried within the town, within the cemetery itself. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, gliding through the rows of graves, its dark gaze fixed on Martha's headstone. Elias watched in terror, paralyzed in his dream state, unable to move, unable to speak, his heart pounding in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of the nightmare. The figure reached Martha's grave, its shadowy hand extending, touching the headstone, its cold presence seeming to seep into the very stone, defiling the sacred ground, desecrating Martha's memory. And then it turned, its faceless gaze locking onto Elias, a silent accusation, a chilling promise of something unspeakable. He would wake up then, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat, his heart racing, the lingering terror of the nightmare clinging to him, refusing to dissipate in the pale light of dawn. The nightmares became a nightly torment, a relentless assault on his sanity, blurring the lines between dream and reality, between the waking world and the shadowy realm that lurked just beyond the veil of sleep. He dreaded nightfall, the approach of sleep, the inevitable descent into the nightmare world where Martha was a ghost and a dark figure haunted the cemetery, where he was drawn back to Martha's grave, night after night, driven by forces he couldn't understand, haunted by visions he couldn't escape. The lilies, the cemetery, the sleepwalking, the nightmares, it all coalesced into a terrifying tapestry of mystery and dread, a deepening darkness that threatened to consume him entirely, to drag him down into the depths of Havenwood's shadowed past, into the heart of the secrets buried beneath the ancient stones of the cemetery, secrets that seemed to be stirring, awakening, reaching out from the grave, into his waking life, into his tormented dreams. And Elias knew, with a chilling certainty, that the mystery of the lilies was no longer just a question of who was leaving them, or why. It had become a question of his own sanity, his own survival, his own desperate struggle against a darkness that was closing in, a darkness that whispered his name in the wind, that haunted his dreams, that drew him relentlessly towards the silent city of the dead, towards the secrets buried beneath Martha's grave, towards an unknown fate that awaited him in the shadows of Havenwood Cemetery. The relentless nightmares and the stark failure of the diazepam to halt his nocturnal cemetery visits had driven Elias to the edge of his endurance. Each morning, he awoke more exhausted, more disoriented, the lingering tendrils of terror from his dreams clinging to him like grave clothes. The shadowy figure, the whispering Martha, the cold dread permeating Havenwood Cemetery. These nightly horrors were eroding his sanity, chipping away at his resolve, leaving him feeling like a hollow shell of his former self. He knew he couldn't continue like this. He was trapped in a terrifying cycle, sleepwalking to Martha's grave, haunted by nightmares, and utterly powerless to break free. Dr. Albright's diagnosis of somnambulism, while initially offering a semblance of comfort, now felt like a cruel misdirection, a label that failed to encompass the true depth of the unsettling phenomena engulfing him. The lilies persisted, a silent, fragrant accusation, marking the rational explanations, amplifying the creeping dread. He sat in his armchair one evening, the kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows around his small cottage, the silence amplifying the turmoil within him. He stared into the flickering flame, its uncertain light mirroring the flickering hope within his own heart. He had tried logic, medicine, his own willpower. All had failed. Perhaps it was time to consider something else, something he had long dismissed as mere superstition, something rooted in the folklore of Havenwood, the very folklore he had always scoffed at, yet now felt inexplicably drawn towards. He thought of Sarah, his daughter. She was different from him, more open to the old ways, more attuned to the whispers of Havenwood's past. She was a librarian in Asheville, surrounded by books, immersed in stories. And he remembered vaguely, from conversations years ago, her interest in local folklore, her fascination with the tales and legends that clung to the Appalachian Mountains like mist to the peaks. Perhaps Sarah, with her knowledge and her different perspective, could offer some insight, some understanding, where logic and medicine had failed. He hesitated. He didn't want to burden Sarah with his troubles, with what might sound like the delusional ramblings of an old man. She had her own life, her own concerns, but the desperation gnawing at him was stronger than his reluctance. He was drowning, and Sarah was his only lifeline. He rose slowly from his armchair, his joints stiff and protesting, and walked to the old rotary phone on the small table in the corner of the room. He hadn't used it in weeks, preferring the isolating silence of his solitude. He picked up the receiver, the cold plastic heavy in his hand, and dialed Sarah's number, his fingers trembling slightly as he rotated the dial. He waited, listening to the rhythmic ringing, each pulse echoing the frantic beat of his own heart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah's voice answered, warm and familiar, a beacon of normalcy in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. "Hello," Sarah's voice, tinged with the faint static of the long-distance line, reached him across the miles, a fragile thread connecting him to the world outside Havenwood, to the daughter he loved, and had tried to shield from the darkness that now seemed to be consuming him. "Sarah," Elias' voice was hoarse, barely recognizable even to his own ears. "Dad, is that you? What's wrong? You sound different." Sarah's concern was immediate, her voice sharpening with worry. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice, to gather the fragments of his fractured thoughts. "Sarah, I need to talk to you. It's about Havenwood and Martha." A pause, a beat of silence on the line, then Sarah's voice, softer now, laced with a deeper concern. "What is it, Dad? What's happened?" He began to speak, the words tumbling out, a torrent of anxieties and fears, a disjointed narrative of lilies and cemeteries, sleepwalking and nightmares, shadowy figures and whispers in the wind. He told her about the mysterious bouquets, about setting up the camera, about the horrifying discovery that he was the one leaving the lilies, about the medication that had failed, about the terrifying nightmares that now haunted his sleep. As he spoke, he could hear Sarah's silence on the other end of the line, a silence that felt both supportive and increasingly worried. He knew his story sounded unbelievable, bordering on madness, but he had to tell her. He had to share the burden, to seek her help, to reach out for some glimmer of understanding in the encroaching darkness. When he finally finished, the silence on the line stretched taut, filled with unspoken questions and anxieties. He waited, his heart pounding, bracing himself for disbelief, for dismissal, for the gentle concern that might mask a deeper worry about his mental state. But Sarah's voice, when it finally came, was not dismissive, not skeptical, but thoughtful, almost intrigued. "Lily's dad," Sarah said slowly, her voice low and measured. "On Martha's grave, and you're leaving them in your sleep." "Yes," Elias whispered, the single word heavy with the weight of his confusion and fear. "I saw it on the video, Sarah. It's me, but I don't remember any of it." Another pause, then Sarah's voice, tinged with a note of something he couldn't quite place, something that sounded like recognition. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. Do you remember any of the old stories about Havenwood Cemetery, the folklore?" Elias frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Folklore? What folklore? You know, I never paid much mind to those old wives' tales. But you remember hearing them, right?" Sarah persisted, her voice gentle but insistent. "About the cemetery, about spirits, about things that aren't always explainable." He hesitated, searching his memory, dredging up fragments of half-forgotten stories, whispers from his childhood, tales told around crackling fires on cold winter nights, tales he had always dismissed as fanciful nonsense, yet now, in the face of his own inexplicable experiences, felt a strange resonance with. "There were stories," Elias admitted slowly, his voice hesitant. "Old stories, about the cemetery being haunted, about strange things happening there, but I never believed them." Maybe it's time to reconsider, Dad," Sarah said softly, her voice laced with a newfound seriousness. "Havenwood has a long history, a dark history, and the cemetery, it's older than the town itself. There are stories, Dad, stories about spirits that linger, spirits that are restless, spirits that can influence the living." Elias felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of his cottage, despite the familiar comfort of Sarah's voice. Spirits, haunted cemeteries. It sounded absurd, ridiculous, yet in the context of his inexplicable sleepwalking, his terrifying nightmares, the persistent mystery of the lilies, it suddenly felt less absurd, less ridiculous, and more disturbingly plausible. "What kind of stories, Sarah?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper, a tremor of unease creeping into his tone. "What kind of spirits?" Sarah hesitated again, then spoke, her voice low and measured, as if recounting a long-forgotten tale, a whispered secret from Havenwood's shadowed past. "There's a story, Dad," Sarah began, her voice taking on a slightly different quality, a storyteller's cadence, a librarian's careful articulation of old words. "A story about a spirit that haunts Havenwood Cemetery. They call it the Weeping Woman of Havenwood." Elias listened, his breath held captive in his lungs, a cold dread seeping into his bones, as Sarah began to recount the tale, a tale of vengeance and despair, a tale that resonated with the unsettling mystery that had taken root in Martha's grave, in his own tormented nights, in the heart of Havenwood Cemetery. "The story goes," Sarah continued, her voice weaving a tapestry of folklore and fear, "that long ago, before Havenwood was even a town, there was a woman, a young woman named Elara. She lived in the mountains, in a small cabin near where the cemetery now stands. She was in love with a miner, a young man named Caleb. They were deeply in love, promised to be married. But then, tragedy struck." Sarah paused, drawing a breath, her voice taking on a somber tone. "Caleb was killed in a mining accident, a cave-in. They say his body was never recovered, buried deep within the earth beneath the mountain." Elias listened intently, his unease growing with each word, the old rotary phone clutched tightly in his hand, Sarah's voice painting a vivid picture of Havenwood's shadowed past. "Elara was heartbroken, Dad," Sarah continued. "Devastated. They say she went mad with grief. She refused to believe Caleb was gone. She would go to the spot where the mine entrance had been, day after day, night after night, weeping, calling out his name, begging him to come back to her." Sarah paused again, her voice softening, taking on a mournful quality. "They say she started seeing things, hearing things, whispers in the wind, shadows moving in the trees. She became convinced that Caleb was still there, trapped, calling out to her from beneath the earth. And then," Elias prompted, his voice barely audible, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and morbid fascination. "And then," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "one night, during a terrible storm, Elara went to the mine entrance again. They say the storm was fierce, lightning flashing, thunder shaking the mountains. And in the midst of the storm, Elara, she disappeared." "Disappeared," Elias repeated, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "Just gone," Sarah said, her voice laced with a hint of mystery. "Vanished without a trace. They searched for her, of course. The townsfolk, the miners, everyone in the valley, but they never found her. No body, no sign, nothing. It was as if she had been swallowed by the mountain itself. And they think her spirit haunts the cemetery?" Elias asked, his voice trembling slightly, the folklore suddenly feeling disturbingly relevant to his own experiences. "That's the story, Dad," Sarah said. "They say Elara's spirit, the weeping woman of Havenwood, still roams the cemetery, searching for Caleb, still consumed by grief and despair. They say she's a vengeful spirit, driven mad by loss, capable of influencing the living." "Influencing the living," Elias repeated, his voice laced with a growing unease. "What do you mean, influencing?" "They say," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that the weeping woman can compel the living to fulfill her desires, that she can whisper into their dreams, plant thoughts in their minds, drive them to act in ways they don't understand, ways that serve her own tormented purpose." Elias listened, his blood running cold, Sarah's words resonating with a chilling familiarity. Compelling the living to fulfill her desires, whispering into dreams, driving them to act in ways they don't understand. It all sounded disturbingly close to his own experiences, his sleepwalking, his nightmares, the lilies on Martha's grave, the unsettling feeling of being driven by forces beyond his control. "And what are her desires?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible, his mind reeling with the implications of Sarah's tale. Sarah paused again, then spoke, her voice low and somber, the words hanging heavy in the air, filling the silence of Elias' cottage with a chilling sense of dread. "They say," Sarah whispered, "that her greatest desire is to be reunited with Caleb, to bring him back from the dead, and that she will use anyone, anything, to achieve that, even the living." The phone line hummed in the silence that followed, the static a faint, unsettling echo of the whispers in Elias' nightmares, the whispers of the wind through the ancient oaks of Havenwood Cemetery, the whispers of a vengeful spirit, a weeping woman, reaching out from the shadows of the past into his tormented present, compelling him towards an unknown, terrifying destiny. The lilies on Martha's grave, he realized with a chilling certainty, might not be a random act of grief, but a thread in a much darker tapestry, a thread woven by a vengeful spirit, a thread leading him deeper into the heart of Havenwood's haunted secrets, towards a confrontation with a darkness he could scarcely comprehend. Elias listened, the rotary phone receiver pressed tightly against his ear, Sarah's words painting a chilling picture of Havenwood's past. The tale of Alara, the weeping woman, resonated with an unsettling familiarity, echoing the whispers of dread that had been plaguing his waking hours and tormenting his sleep. The idea of a vengeful spirit, driven by loss and capable of influencing the living, felt less like folklore now, and more like a terrifyingly plausible explanation for the inexplicable events that had befallen him. "A pact with the dead," Elias murmured, more to himself than to Sarah, the phrase echoing in the silence of his cottage, heavy with a newfound significance. "Not exactly a pact, Dad," Sarah corrected gently, her voice still tinged with that thoughtful, almost hesitant quality. "More like an influence, a pull. The stories say the weeping woman can draw on the grief and vulnerability of the living, especially those connected to the cemetery, to amplify her own desires, to try and bridge the gap between worlds. And you think this weeping woman, she's connected to the lilies?" Elias asked, the question hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. "It's just a theory, Dad," Sarah cautioned, her voice softening. "But it's worth considering. Lilies in folklore are often associated with death, with funerals, with transitions. And white lilies, they can symbolize purity, innocence, but also mourning, sorrow. Maybe she's using the lilies as a way to draw your attention, to lure you to Martha's grave, to use your grief, your connection to Martha, for her own purpose." Elias shivered, despite the warmth of the kerosene lamp, Sarah's words sending a cold tendril of fear snaking through him. The lilies, once a symbol of his love for Martha, now felt tainted, imbued with a darker meaning, a potential tool of a vengeful spirit. "But why me, Sarah?" Elias asked, his voice laced with confusion and a growing sense of dread. "Why would she choose me? I'm just an old man grieving for his wife." "Maybe it's not just you, Dad," Sarah said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe it's your connection to Martha, to the cemetery itself. Think about it. Martha is buried there in Havenwood Cemetery. You've been visiting her grave every week for years. You have a strong emotional link to that place, to the dead buried there. Maybe the weeping woman is drawn to that link, to your vulnerability, to your grief." Sarah paused, then added, her voice taking on a more practical tone. "Dad, have you ever looked into Martha's family history? Did she have any ancestors who were connected to Havenwood in a significant way? Maybe someone buried in the cemetery a long time ago, someone who might have attracted the attention of something like the weeping woman." Elias frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. Martha's family history, he knew very little about it, to be honest. Martha had been a private person, not one to dwell on the past. He knew her parents had been farmers in the valley, simple, hard-working folk. Beyond that, her ancestry was a closed book, a forgotten chapter in the town's already fading history. I don't know, Sarah," Elias admitted, his voice hesitant. "Martha never talked much about her family history. Her parents were just farmers, simple people." "But what about before them, Dad?" Sarah persisted, her voice gently probing. "Grandparents, great-grandparents. Havenwood has been settled for generations. Families have deep roots here. Maybe there's something in Martha's family history, something buried in the past, that's connected to the cemetery, to the weeping woman legend, to what's happening now." Sarah's suggestion sparked a flicker of possibility in Elias' mind, a new avenue of investigation, a potential key to unlocking the mystery that had ensnared him. Researching Martha's family history. It was a long shot, perhaps, but it was something he could do, something he could explore, a tangible step he could take to break free from the cycle of fear and uncertainty. "Maybe you're right, Sarah," Elias said slowly, his voice gaining a newfound resolve. "Maybe there is something in Martha's family history, something we don't know." "We could look into it, Dad," Sarah offered, her voice brightening slightly, a hint of excitement creeping into her tone. "I could come down to Havenwood. We could go to the library, the historical society, maybe even the cemetery records office. We could try to piece together Martha's family tree, see if we can find any connections to the cemetery, any hints of anything unusual." Elias hesitated for a moment, considering Sarah's offer. He had been so isolated in his grief, so resistant to involving anyone else in his troubles. But Sarah's suggestion felt different, felt like a genuine offer of help, a shared quest for answers. And the thought of having Sarah by his side, working together to unravel the mystery, offered a glimmer of comfort, a sense of shared purpose in the encroaching darkness. "Yes, Sarah," Elias said, his voice firming with resolve. "Yes, come down to Havenwood. Let's look into Martha's family history. Let's see if we can find out what's going on." "I'll come first thing tomorrow, Dad," Sarah said, her voice filled with a newfound energy. "We'll start at the library. They have local history records, genealogical resources. We can see what we can find." "Thank you, Sarah," Elias said, a wave of gratitude washing over him, a sense of relief at finally having someone to share his burden, someone to help him navigate the labyrinth of mystery and fear that had engulfed his life. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, Dad," Sarah said softly. "I'll be there. We'll figure this out together." They ended the call, Elias placing the receiver back on the cradle, the dial tone buzzing in the silence of his cottage. He felt a flicker of hope rekindle within him, a fragile spark in the encroaching darkness. Sarah was coming. They would research Martha's family history. They would search for answers in the dusty records of Havenwood's past. They would face the mystery together. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would find a way to break free from the unsettling grip of the lilies, the nightmares, and the shadows that haunted Havenwood Cemetery. The next morning, Sarah arrived in Havenwood, her small car pulling up the dusty drive to Elias' cottage just as the morning mist began to lift from the valley. Elias greeted her with a weary but hopeful smile, the sight of his daughter, her bright, intelligent eyes and determined demeanor, bolstering his spirits, offering a tangible sense of support in the face of the unknown. After a brief, comforting hug, they set out for the Havenwood Public Library, a small, unassuming building nestled in the heart of town, its brick facade weathered and worn, its windows reflecting the gray Appalachian sky. The library, like much of Havenwood, felt steeped in history, its shelves lined with old, leather-bound books, its air thick with the scent of aging paper and forgotten stories. Mrs. Peterson, the town librarian, a kindly woman with a warm smile and a deep knowledge of Havenwood's history, greeted them warmly. Sarah explained their purpose, their desire to research Martha's family history, their hope of uncovering some connection to the town's past. Mrs. Peterson, intrigued by their quest, readily offered her assistance, guiding them to the local history section, a quiet corner of the library filled with genealogical records, town histories, and old newspaper clippings. They started with the genealogical records, dusty volumes filled with handwritten family trees, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death certificates. Sarah, with her librarian's training and meticulous attention to detail, took the lead, patiently tracing Martha's family name, Bellamy, back through the generations, carefully noting each ancestor, each connection, each piece of the puzzle. Elias, though less familiar with genealogical research, helped as best he could, his aged eyes scanning the faded handwriting, his memory dredging up fragments of stories and anecdotes Martha had occasionally shared about her family. Hours passed, the afternoon sun beginning to slant through the library windows, casting long shadows across the room. They meticulously worked their way through the records, tracing the Bellamy family line back to the early days of Havenwood's settlement, uncovering a tapestry of farmers, miners, and shopkeepers, ordinary folk who had lived and died in the valley. their lives interwoven with the town's history. As they delved deeper into the past, they started to uncover hints of something more, something beyond the ordinary lives of Martha's ancestors. A mention of a distant relative, a woman named Elspeth Bellamy, in the town's historical records, associated with a period of unusual unrest in Havenwood in the late 18th century. A faded newspaper clipping, tucked away in a forgotten folder, detailing accusations of witchcraft and dark practices leveled against an Elspeth Bellamy during a time of crop failures and unexplained illnesses in the town. And a cryptic entry in the cemetery records, a notation of an unmarked grave within the old section of Havenwood Cemetery, attributed to an unnamed Bellamy woman during that same period. A chill ran down Elia's spine as Sarah read aloud the newspaper clipping, the words witchcraft, dark practices, and unmarked grave echoing in the quiet library, resonating with the unsettling mystery that had brought them here. Witchcraft. It was a word whispered in Havenwood, a relic of a superstitious past, a dark stain on the town's history. But could it be more than just a relic? Could it be connected to the present, to the lilies, to the weeping woman legend, to the inexplicable events plaguing his life? Elspeth Bellamy, Sarah murmured, her brow furrowed in thought, her gaze fixed on the faded newspaper clipping. Martha's ancestor, accused of witchcraft, buried in an unmarked grave in Havenwood Cemetery. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a dawning realization. Dad, do you think this could be it? Could this Elspeth Bellamy be connected to the weeping woman legend? Could she be the source of what's happening? Elias stared at the newspaper clipping, the faded ink blurring before his aged eyes, his mind reeling with the implications of their discovery. Witchcraft, a long-forgotten scandal, a buried secret in Martha's family history. Could this be the key to unraveling the mystery of the lilies, the key to understanding the unsettling forces that seem to be emanating from Havenwood Cemetery? It's possible, Sarah, Elias said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, a tremor of unease creeping into his tone. It's more than possible. It's starting to make sense. The cemetery, the folklore, Martha's family history, it's all starting to connect. Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the newspaper clipping, her mind racing, piecing together the fragments of information, weaving a narrative of Havenwood's dark past, a past that seemed to be reaching out from the grave into their present. We need to find this unmarked grave, Dad, Sarah said, her voice firming with resolve. We need to go to the cemetery. We need to see if we can find Elspeth Bellamy's grave. Elias nodded in agreement, a renewed sense of purpose surging through him, a determination to uncover the truth, to confront the darkness that seemed to be lurking beneath the surface of Havenwood's history, beneath the ancient stones of the cemetery, buried alongside Martha's ancestor, the woman accused of witchcraft, the woman buried in an unmarked grave. The lilies, he realized with a chilling certainty, might not be a message from Martha, but a signpost, a ghostly marker pointing towards a long-forgotten scandal, a buried secret, a darkness that had been waiting to be unearthed, waiting to be awakened. And he, Elias, and Sarah were now on the path to unearthing it, drawn deeper into the heart of Havenwood's haunted past, towards a confrontation with a truth that might be more terrifying than they could ever imagine. They thanked Mrs. Peterson for her help, the librarian offering a knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of the undercurrents of unease that seemed to ripple beneath the surface of Havenwood's quiet facade. They left the library, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the town square, the air growing cooler, the sky darkening with the promise of evening. They walked in silence towards Havenwood Cemetery, the weight of their discovery settling upon them, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. What would they find in the unmarked grave of Elspeth Bellamy? What secrets would the ancient stones of Havenwood Cemetery reveal? And what darkness would they awaken in their quest for the truth? As they entered the cemetery gates, the familiar sense of unease washed over Elias, amplified now by the weight of their discovery, the chilling tale of Elspeth Bellamy, the woman accused of witchcraft, the ancestor buried in an unmarked grave. The ancient stones seemed to watch them. The whispering trees seemed to murmur secrets on the wind. The very air felt charged with an unseen presence. a palpable sense of history, of sorrow, of something dark and long buried. They walked slowly through the cemetery, guided by the cemetery records they had copied at the library, searching for the old section, the area where graves from the late 18th century might be located. The cemetery seemed different this time, more oppressive, more menacing, the lengthening shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the weathered stones. The silence felt heavier, more profound, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant caw of a crow. Sounds that seemed to amplify the sense of isolation, of being watched, of stepping into a realm beyond the ordinary world. They reached the old section, a neglected corner of the cemetery overgrown with weeds and ivy, the stones older, more weathered, many of them tilted and broken, their inscriptions faded and illegible. It was a place of forgotten memories, of lost stories, a silent testament to the relentless march of time and the ephemeral nature of human existence. They began to search, carefully examining each stone, each marker, looking for any clue, any hint of an unmarked grave, any indication of Elspeth Bellamy's final resting place. They moved slowly, deliberately, their eyes scanning the overgrown landscape, their hearts pounding with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Sarah consulted the cemetery records again, her finger tracing the faded handwritten notes, searching for any specific location, any landmark that might help them pinpoint the unmarked grave. It says, "Old section, near the western wall, unmarked field," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible above the rustling of leaves. Unmarked field. What does that mean? They looked around, their gaze sweeping across the overgrown section, their eyes searching for anything that might resemble an unmarked field. Then Elias saw it. A patch of ground, slightly apart from the rows of marked graves, an area overgrown with weeds and tall grass, a section that looked undisturbed, untouched, almost deliberately avoided. An unmarked field within the city of the dead. "Sarah, look," Elias said, pointing towards the overgrown patch of ground, his voice hushed with a sense of foreboding. "Over there. Could that be it? The unmarked field?" Sarah followed his gaze, her eyes widening as she took in the neglected patch of ground. It looked different from the rest of the cemetery, more wild, more untamed, a space that seemed to resist cultivation, a place where the earth itself seemed to hold onto its secrets. They approached the unmarked field slowly, their steps hesitant, their senses heightened, the air around them feeling colder, heavier, imbued with a palpable sense of mystery. As they drew closer, they noticed something else, something that sent a fresh wave of unease washing over them. In the center of the unmarked field, amidst the weeds and tall grass, was a single, stark white lily, blooming incongruously in the neglected space, its elegant trumpet unfurled like a silent sentinel, its fragrance heavy and cloying in the still air. A single white lily, blooming in an unmarked grave. The lilies on Martha's grave, the legend of the weeping woman, the witchcraft accusations against Elspeth Bellamy, the unmarked grave in the cemetery. It all coalesced into a terrifying pattern, a web of mystery and dread, a sense of forces beyond their comprehension converging in this forgotten corner of Havenwood Cemetery. They reached the edge of the unmarked field, their gaze fixed on the single white lily, its stark whiteness a stark contrast to the overgrown surroundings. They stepped into the field, the tall grass brushing against their legs, the silence around them deepening, the sense of being watched intensifying. They walked towards the lily, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing with questions, with anxieties, with a growing sense of dread. As they drew closer to the lily, they noticed something else, something small, almost hidden beneath the tall grass at the base of the lily stem. A small, weathered stone, almost completely buried in the earth, its surface covered in moss and lichen, its shape indistinct, its purpose unknown. Elias knelt down, his knees creaking in protest, and carefully cleared away the weeds and grass surrounding the stone. Sarah knelt beside him, her breath held captive in her lungs, her gaze fixed on the emerging stone. As they cleared away the debris, the shape of the stone became clearer, more defined. It was a headstone, small and simple, but undeniably a headstone. And as they cleared away the last vestiges of moss and lichen, a faint inscription began to emerge from the weathered surface, etched in faded, barely legible letters. They leaned closer, their eyes straining to decipher the inscription, the silence around them broken only by their ragged breaths, the weight of anticipation hanging heavy in the air. And then, slowly, painstakingly, they began to make out the words, the faded letters forming themselves into a name that sent a chill down their spines, a name that confirmed their deepest fears, a name that linked the lilies, the nightmares, the weeping woman legend, and the darkness that haunted Havenwood Cemetery to a single, terrifying source. The inscription, barely visible on the weathered stone, reads simply, Elspeth Bellamy. Elspeth Bellamy. The name, etched in faded, barely legible letters on the weathered stone, hung in the air between Elias and Sarah, a whispered confirmation of their fears, a chilling echo from Havenwood's shadowed past. A cold dread settled over Elias, heavier than the damp cemetery air, a sense of inevitability, as if they had been walking towards this moment, towards this grave, since the first mysterious lilies had appeared on Martha's stone. He reached out a trembling hand and traced the faded letters of Elspeth's name, the rough texture of the stone cold beneath his fingertips. The headstone was small, unassuming, a simple slab of grey fieldstone, almost swallowed by the encroaching earth and vegetation. Unlike the other markers in the cemetery, ornate monuments to lives lived and lost, this stone was stark, unadorned, a silent testament to a life deliberately forgotten, a history intentionally buried. Sarah knelt beside him, her gaze fixed on the inscription, her brow furrowed in thought. Elspeth Bellamy, she repeated, her voice hushed with reverence and a hint of fear. It's her. This is her grave. The unmarked field stretched around them, a patch of wildness within the ordered rows of the cemetery, a space that felt different, charged with a palpable energy, a sense of something ancient and restless stirring beneath the surface. The single white lily, blooming incongruously in the center of the field, seemed to pulse with an unnatural luminescence in the fading light, its fragrance almost overpowering in its sweetness, a cloying, unsettling perfume that filled the air around them. Elias stood up slowly, his knees protesting with a chorus of creaks and groans, and surveyed the headstone more closely. It was more than just a simple slab of stone. As he examined it in the fading light, he noticed something he hadn't seen at first glance, something almost hidden, almost deliberately concealed beneath the weathering and the lichen. On the lower right corner of the headstone, partially obscured by a patch of moss, was a carving, a symbol. Small, intricate, almost invisible at first, but undeniably there. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim light, his heart beginning to pound again, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He carefully cleared away the remaining moss and lichen with his trembling fingers, revealing the symbol in its entirety. It was a circle, intricately carved into the stone, and within the circle, a spiral, a swirling vortex of lines that seemed to draw the eye inwards, into its depths, into its center. The symbol was both familiar and deeply unsettling. Familiar because he had seen it before. Not here, not in the cemetery, but somewhere else, somewhere, darker, more elusive. And unsettling because there was something inherently disturbing about the symbol itself, something that resonated with a primal unease, a sense of something ancient and unknowable lurking just beneath the surface of the familiar world. He stared at the symbol, his brow furrowing in concentration, his memory straining to grasp the elusive connection, to place the image that flickered at the edges of his awareness. Where had he seen this symbol before? It was like a half-forgotten dream, a fleeting image glimpsed in the shadows, a whisper carried on the wind. And then it clicked, a sudden, sharp jolt of recognition, a terrifying realization that sent a wave of cold dread washing over him. The nightmares. He had seen the symbol in his nightmares, not just once, but repeatedly, night after night, flickering at the edges of his dream visions, lurking in the shadows of his tormented sleep, a recurring motif in the terrifying landscape of his subconscious. The shadowy figure, the whispering Martha, the cold dread of the cemetery, and the symbol, the circle and the spiral, always present, always there, an ominous undercurrent to the nightly horrors that plagued him. The symbol from his nightmares, carved into the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, the woman accused of witchcraft, the ancestor buried in an unmarked grave. The connection was undeniable, terrifying, a chilling confirmation that the nightmares were not just figments of his imagination, but somehow linked to this place, to this grave, to the dark history of Havenwood Cemetery. He recoiled from the headstone as if burned, stumbling backwards, his breath catching in his throat. He felt a sudden, sharp pain lance through his head, a blinding flash of agony that exploded behind his eyes, sending him reeling, his vision blurring, the world around him dissolving into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. He cried out, a strangled gasp of pain clutching at his temples, his knees buckling beneath him. He sank to the ground, the damp earth cold against his skin, the world spinning around him, the pain in his head intensifying, a relentless throbbing that threatened to shatter his skull. Dad, what's wrong?" Sarah's voice, sharp with alarm, cut through the fog of pain, reaching him from a distance, a lifeline in the swirling chaos. He tried to speak, to answer her, but no words would come, his breath caught in his throat, his body convulsing with pain. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the blinding agony, but the pain only intensified, throbbing, pulsating, echoing in the depths of his skull. And then, amidst the pain, amidst the swirling darkness, a vision bloomed before his closed eyes, vivid, terrifying, impossibly real. Martha. He saw Martha, not as he remembered her, vibrant and full of life, but pale, ethereal, her form translucent, shimmering in the dim light of the cemetery. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face etched with despair, her lips moving, forming words he could barely hear, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Ilias, help me, please help me." Her voice was weak, strained, filled with a desperate plea, a haunting echo of the Martha he had loved and lost, yet somehow, different, altered, imbued with a sorrow that transcended mortal grief, a despair that resonated with the darkness of the cemetery, with the legend of the weeping woman, with the secrets buried beneath the unmarked grave. He stared at a vision, his heart clenching in his chest, a wave of grief and terror washing over him, his own pain momentarily forgotten in the face of Martha's desperate plea. "Martha," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a choked sob escaping his lips. "Martha, is that you?" She nodded slowly, her ethereal form shimmering, her eyes fixed on him, filled with an unbearable sadness, a desperate appeal. "Help me, Ilias, I'm trapped. She won't let me go, help me." "Trapped," Ilias whispered, his mind reeling, his understanding struggling to grasp the impossible reality of the vision. "Trapped where, Martha? Who won't let you go?" Her vision flickered, wavering, as if struggling to maintain its form, the darkness of the cemetery pressing in around her, threatening to engulf her, to pull her back into the shadows. Her voice weakened further, fading to a mere whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind like a dying breath. "Elspeth, she's holding me in the darkness. Help me, Elias, please help me." The vision shimmered again, then faded, dissolving into the swirling darkness, Martha's desperate plea echoing in his mind, a haunting whisper that lingered in the silence of the cemetery, a chilling confirmation of his deepest fears, a terrifying revelation of the forces at play. Elspeth Bellamy, the woman accused of witchcraft, buried in an unmarked grave, her symbol carved into the headstone. Elspeth, the weeping woman of Havenwood, the vengeful spirit, holding Martha captive, trapped in the darkness of the cemetery, using the lilies, the nightmares, his own grief, to draw him closer, to lure him into her tormented realm, for her own dark, unknown purpose. The headache, though still throbbing, seemed to recede slightly, overshadowed by the chilling weight of the vision, the terrifying implications of Martha's plea. He opened his eyes, blinking against the fading light, his gaze searching for Sarah, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a desperate resolve. Sarah was kneeling beside him, her face etched with worry, her hand gently resting on his arm. "Dad, are you all right? What happened? You just collapsed." He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a newfound understanding. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse, trembling with emotion. "I saw her. I saw Martha. She spoke to me. She needs help." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion, her gaze searching his face, trying to decipher the frantic urgency in his voice, the haunted look in his eyes. "Martha, you saw Martha, here, in the cemetery." Ilias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the unmarked grave, on the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, on the single white lily blooming in the gathering gloom. "She's trapped, Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elspeth is holding her. In the darkness. She needs our help. Martha needs our help." Sarah stared at him, her initial confusion slowly giving way to a dawning realization, a growing understanding of the terror in his voice, the chilling certainty in his eyes. She looked at the unmarked grave, at the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, at the single white lily, and a cold dread began to creep into her own heart, a sense that they had stumbled upon something far more sinister, far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, a darkness that had been awakened, a secret that had been unearthed, a haunting that had just begun. The lilies, the nightmares, the weeping woman legend, Elspeth Bellamy, Martha's plea, it all converged in this forgotten corner of Havenwood Cemetery, in the unmarked grave, beneath the ancient stones, in the heart of a mystery that was no longer just about flowers on a grave, but about souls trapped, spirits restless, and a darkness that was reaching out from the shadows of the past to claim them both. And as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, and the shadows of Havenwood Cemetery deepened around them, Elias and Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that their quest for answers had just begun, and that the unmarked grave of Elspeth Bellamy held secrets that would test their courage, their sanity, and their very souls. The air grew colder, the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the trees, and the single white lily in the unmarked grave glowed with an eerie luminescence, a silent beacon in the gathering darkness, beckoning them deeper into the heart of the mystery, towards a confrontation with a darkness that had been waiting in the shadows for centuries, waiting to be awakened. Sarah stared at Elias, her face pale in the twilight gloom, the flickering lamplight from the cemetery entrance barely reaching them in the overgrown corner of the graveyard. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the impossible, the terrifying, the undeniable. "She's trapped. Elspeth is holding her, in the darkness. Help me." Martha's plea echoed in Sarah's own mind, a chilling whisper that seemed to emanate from the very stones around them, from the unmarked grave at their feet, from the single, unnervingly luminous lily. "Dad," Sarah said slowly, her voice trembling slightly, Are you sure it was Martha? It wasn't just a hallucination, the pain in your head?" Elias shook his head, his gaze fixed on the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, his expression one of haunted certainty. "It was her, Sarah. I know it was her. It was Martha's voice, her eyes. I felt her sadness, her fear. She needs help. She's trapped here, because of Elspeth." Sarah swallowed hard, the rational part of her mind struggling to reconcile with the impossible reality her father was describing. Ghosts, spirits, vengeful ancestors holding souls captive. It was the stuff of folklore, of old wives' tales, the very stories Havenwood was steeped in, stories she had always approached with a librarian's detached curiosity, never expecting to confront them in the stark reality of her own life. But looking at her father's face, seeing the genuine terror and conviction in his aged eyes, she couldn't dismiss it, couldn't rationalize it away as mere delusion or grief-induced hallucination. Something profound, something unsettling, was happening here in Havenwood Cemetery, connected to Martha's grave, to Elspeth Bellamy, to the legends whispered in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. "Okay, Dad," Sarah said, her voice firming with a newfound resolve, pushing back the rising tide of fear, drawing on her librarian's training, her instinct to investigate, to understand, to find answers in the face of the unknown. "Okay, let's assume it was Martha. Let's assume she's trapped and Elspeth is holding her. What do we do?" Elias looked at her, his eyes searching hers, a glimmer of hope flickering within the haunted depths. "I don't know, Sarah," he admitted, his voice heavy with despair. "I don't know how to help her. I don't know how to fight a spirit, especially a vengeful spirit like the weeping woman. We need to learn more about Elspeth," Sarah said, her mind racing, piecing together the fragments of information they had gathered, the library records, the newspaper clipping, the weeping woman legend, Martha's plea, the symbol on the headstone. "We need to understand why she's doing this, what she wants. Maybe if we understand her, we can find a way to help Martha, to break whatever hold Elspeth has on her." "But how, Sarah?" Elias asked, his voice laced with desperation. "How do we learn more about a spirit? How do we fight something we can't even see?" Sarah stood up, brushing the damp earth from her knees, her gaze sweeping across the unmarked field, the ancient stones, the whispering trees, the deepening shadows of Havenwood Cemetery. "We start with what we know, Dad," she said, her voice gaining strength, her librarian's instinct taking over, transforming fear into a focused determination to seek knowledge, to unravel the mystery, to find a path through the darkness. "We start with Elspeth Bellamy. We start with this grave. We start with the stories." She looked at the headstone, at the symbol carved into the corner, her gaze lingering on the swirling spiral within the circle. "This symbol, Dad," she said, pointing to the carving, her voice thoughtful. "Do you recognize it? You said you've seen it in your nightmares." Elias nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration, his gaze fixed on the symbol, his memory still struggling to grasp the elusive connection, to bring the shadowy images from his nightmares into the clear light of waking consciousness. "Yes," he murmured, his voice hesitant. "I've seen it. In the nightmares. Always in the shadows. Always watching." Sarah pulled out her phone, the screen illuminating her face in the fading light, and took a picture of the symbol, the flash momentarily startling in the gathering gloom. "I'll look it up, Dad," she said, her voice determined. "Online. In my books. Maybe it's a witchcraft symbol, something connected to Elspeth's accusations. Maybe it can tell us something about her power, about how to fight her." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the wind whispering through the trees, the shadows deepening around them, the single white lily glowing with an eerie luminescence in the twilight. The air felt charged with an unseen presence, a palpable sense of history, of mystery, of danger. "We should go, Dad," Sarah said finally, her voice low, urging him to leave. "It's getting dark. We can come back tomorrow. We can start researching Elspeth, the symbol, the weeping woman legend. We can figure this out, Dad. We will help Martha." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the unmarked grave, on the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, on the single white lily. He felt a heavy weight in his heart, a sense of responsibility, a desperate need to fulfill Martha's plea, to break her free from whatever darkness held her captive. He stood up, his joints aching, his body weary, but his spirit, fueled by a desperate love and a newfound resolve, flickering with a fragile spark of hope. They turned and walked away from the unmarked grave, leaving Elspeth Bellamy and the single white lily in the gathering gloom, the ancient stones of Havenwood Cemetery watching them in silent judgment, the secrets of the past stirring beneath their feet, waiting to be unearthed. As they walked towards the cemetery gates, Elias glanced back one last time, his gaze drawn to the unmarked field, to the small, weathered headstone, to the symbol carved into the corner, to the single white lily glowing in the darkness. He felt a chilling certainty that they were not just researching history, not just unraveling a mystery, but stepping into a realm beyond the ordinary, a realm of spirits and shadows, of vengeance and despair, a realm where the past was not just buried, but alive, and reaching out to claim them both. Back at the cottage, Sarah immediately set to work, her laptop open on the kitchen table, the screen casting a cool blue light across the room. She searched online for information about the symbol, the circle and the spiral, typing in keywords like witchcraft symbols, Celtic spirals, ancient glyphs, Appalachian folklore. Elias watched her, his gaze fixed on the screen, his mind still reeling from the vision of Martha, her desperate plea echoing in his thoughts. Sarah sifted through websites, articles, images, her librarian's eye scanning for relevant information, for connections to Elspeth Bellamy, to Havenwood, to the Weeping Woman legend. She found numerous references to spirals in Celtic and pre-Celtic cultures, symbols of growth, eternity, the journey of life, but also symbols associated with death, the underworld, the cyclical nature of time, the journey of the soul. The circle, she learned, often represented wholeness, unity, protection, but also containment, imprisonment, the boundaries between worlds. The combination of circle and spiral, she discovered, was sometimes interpreted as a symbol of spiritual journey, of descent into the inner self, or into the realm of the dead, a potentially dangerous path, a journey fraught with peril. "It's a spiral within a circle, Dad," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful, her gaze still fixed on the screen. "It's an ancient symbol found in many cultures. It can represent a lot of things, but some interpretations are definitely darker. Journey into the underworld, spiritual entrapment, cyclical patterns of death and rebirth. She paused, then scrolled further down a web page, her eyes widening slightly as she read. Wait a minute, here's something. In Appalachian folklore, certain spiral symbols are associated with binding spirits, with trapping them in a specific location, preventing them from moving on. Sometimes used in protective wards, but also sometimes used in curses. Sarah looked up at Elias, her face pale, her eyes filled with a growing unease. Curses, Dad, she whispered, the word hanging heavy in the air. Could she have been cursed? Or could she have been using curses herself? Could this symbol be connected to her witchcraft accusations, to her vengeful spirit, to Martha being trapped? Elias listened, his heart pounding in his chest, Sarah's words confirming his deepest fears, painting a darker, more sinister picture of Elspeth Bellamy, of her connection to Havenwood Cemetery, to the mystery that was consuming them. Curses, binding spirits, trapping souls. It sounded like the stuff of nightmares, of horror stories, yet in the context of his own terrifying experiences, it felt disturbingly real, disturbingly plausible. We need to find out more about Elspeth, Sarah, Elias said, his voice firming with a renewed resolve. We need to know what happened to her, why she was accused of witchcraft, why she's buried in an unmarked grave. We need to understand her story, her pain, her anger. Maybe if we understand her, we can find a way to break whatever curse she's under, whatever hold she has on Martha. Tomorrow, Dad, Sarah said, nodding in agreement, her voice determined. Tomorrow we go back to the library. We need to delve deeper into the local history records, the town archives, anything we can find about Elspeth Bellamy, about the witchcraft accusations, about the time period she lived in. Maybe there are old journals, letters, town records that can tell us more about her story, about the darkness that surrounds her. They continued to research online for a while longer, Sarah searching for more information about the symbol, about Appalachian folklore, about witchcraft accusations in the region. Elias sat silently, his mind racing, Martha's plea echoing in his thoughts, the image of Elspeth Bellamy's unmarked grave, the single white lily, the spiral symbol, all swirling together in a vortex of mystery and dread. As the night deepened, the wind outside the cottage began to pick up, whispering through the trees, carrying echoes of the ancient oaks of Havenwood Cemetery, murmuring tales of forgotten things, secrets buried beneath the earth, spirits restless in the shadows. Elias felt a growing sense of unease, a chilling premonition of the nightmares that awaited him, the darkness that would soon descend, the shadowy figure that would once again draw him towards Martha's grave, towards the heart of the mystery, towards an unknown, terrifying destiny. He took the diazepam tablet, the small white pill feeling less like a beacon of hope now, and more like a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness, a temporary respite in the face of a force far greater than himself, a force that seemed to be emanating from Havenwood Cemetery, from the unmarked grave of Elspeth Bellamy, from the depths of a past that refused to stay buried. And as he drifted off to sleep, the whispers of the wind seemed to carry Martha's voice, faint and desperate, echoing in his dreams, a haunting plea carried on the night air. Help me, Elias, please help me. The next day, fortified by a meager breakfast and a shared sense of grim purpose, Elias and Sarah returned to the Havenwood Public Library. The morning was overcast, the sky a uniform grey that seemed to press down on the valley, mirroring the somber mood that hung heavy between them. The library, usually a haven of quietude, felt different today, charged with an almost palpable sense of anticipation, as if the very books on the shelves were holding their breath, waiting to reveal their secrets. Mrs. Peterson greeted them with a knowing smile, her eyes holding a hint of curiosity and concern. "Back for more history, I see," she remarked gently, her voice a low murmur in the hushed space. Sarah nodded, returning the smile, though her own felt strained, forced. "Yes, Mrs. Peterson, we're hoping to delve a little deeper this time, into the town archives if possible, and perhaps any church records from the late 1700s. Mrs. Peterson's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of something akin to apprehension crossing her features. Church records from that period are fragile, Elias, Sarah, and town archives from that era, well, they're not always readily accessible. That was a difficult time in Havenwood's history. Some things are best left undisturbed. Her words hung in the air, a gentle warning, a subtle echo of Silas's cryptic pronouncements in the cemetery. Elias met Mrs. Peterson's gaze, his own eyes holding a quiet determination. "We understand, Mrs. Peterson, but we believe it's important. For personal reasons, we need to understand what happened back then." Mrs. Peterson studied his face for a moment, her gaze searching, assessing. Then, with a sigh, she nodded slowly. "Very well, Elias. Very well, Sarah. Follow me. I'll see what I can find." She led them through the stacks, past rows of silent books, towards a back room, a dimly lit space filled with towering shelves, crammed with boxes, folders, and bound volumes. The air in the back room was thick with the scent of dust and aging paper, the smell of forgotten stories, of buried secrets waiting to be unearthed. "This is our archives room," Mrs. Peterson explained, her voice hushed, almost reverent. "Town records, church registers, old maps, local histories, it's all here, organized as best we can manage. The records from the late 1700s, the period you're interested in, are mostly in these boxes over here." She gestured towards a stack of dusty cardboard boxes piled in a corner, their labels faded and handwritten, their contents hinting at the long-forgotten lives and events of Havenwood's past. "Be careful with them," Mrs. Peterson cautioned, her voice gentle but firm. "They're fragile, and some of the stories they tell, they can be unsettling. Let me know if you need anything." She left them alone in the archives room, the silence closing in around them, the weight of history pressing down, the scent of dust and secrets filling their nostrils. Sarah and Elias began to sift through the boxes, carefully opening each one, gently lifting out the fragile documents, their hands trembling slightly as they touched the brittle paper, the handwritten words of generations past. They found town meeting minutes, tax records, property deeds, wills and probate documents, fragments of lives pieced together from the dry, official language of the past. They searched for any mention of Elspeth Bellamy, any record of the witchcraft accusations, any detail that might shed light on her story, on her life, on her death, on the darkness that seemed to cling to her name. Hours passed, the morning light filtering through the dusty window, casting long shafts of illumination across the room, illuminating the faded ink, the yellowed paper, the silent witnesses to Havenwood's hidden history. They found fragments, glimpses, whispers of Elspeth's story scattered throughout the records. A mention in the town meeting minutes of concerns regarding the behavior of Elspeth Bellamy and the unsettling events occurring in the valley. A reference in a church register to the lamentable accusations leveled against Sister Elspeth and the cloud of suspicion that has fallen upon her soul. A cryptic note in a private journal belonging to a long-dead town elder speaking of dark omens and unnatural afflictions, and hinting at a female presence wielding powers beyond mortal comprehension. They pieced together a fragmented picture of Elspeth Bellamy, a woman living on the fringes of Havenwood society in the late 1700s, a time of hardship and uncertainty in the Appalachian Mountains. Crop failures, harsh winters, outbreaks of illness, the valley was struggling. Fear and superstition were rampant, and in such times, scapegoats were often sought. Blame was often assigned to those who were different, those who were perceived as outsiders, those who possessed knowledge or skills that were not easily understood. Elspeth, they discovered, was a woman of knowledge. The records hinted at her skill with herbs and healing, her understanding of the natural world, her solitary life in a small cabin on the outskirts of the settlement. In a time of limited medical knowledge and deep-seated superstition, her skills might have been seen as both valuable and suspect, her knowledge perceived as both a gift and a threat. The witchcraft accusations, they learned, had arisen during a particularly harsh winter, following a series of unexplained misfortunes that had befallen the town. Livestock sickness, crop failures, a mysterious illness that swept through the valley. Fear and panic had gripped Havenwood, and Elspeth, with her solitary ways and her knowledge of herbs and healing, had become an easy target for suspicion, a convenient scapegoat for the town's collective anxieties. The newspaper clipping they had found earlier, detailing the accusations, painted a stark picture of a community gripped by fear and superstition, turning against one of its own, driven by anxieties they couldn't understand, seeking to blame and punish in the face of the inexplicable. Witchcraft and dark practices, the clipping proclaimed, the words echoing the fear and ignorance of a bygone era. Elspeth Bellamy, a woman dwelling in solitude, accused of consorting with unnatural forces and bringing misfortune upon our blessed valley. But as they delved deeper into the records, they also began to uncover hints of a different narrative, whispers of doubt, fragments of dissent, suggesting that not everyone in Havenwood had believed the accusations against Elspeth, that there had been voices of reason, of compassion, even amidst the tide of fear and superstition. A faded letter, tucked away in a church archive, written by a local clergyman, expressed concern about the hasty judgment against Sister Elspeth, and urged caution against succumbing to unfounded fears and baseless accusations. A cryptic entry in a town elder's journal hinted at political machinations and personal vendettas behind the accusations, suggesting that Elspeth might have been targeted not out of genuine fear of witchcraft, but for other, more worldly reasons, perhaps land disputes, or personal rivalries, or power struggles within the small, isolated community. The records were fragmented, incomplete, filled with gaps and silences, but as Sarah and Elias pieced together the fragments, a more complex, more nuanced picture of Elspeth Bellamy began to emerge, a picture that went beyond the simplistic label of witch, and revealed a woman caught in the crosscurrents of a troubled time, a woman perhaps misunderstood, perhaps unjustly accused, perhaps a victim of fear and prejudice, rather than a perpetrator of dark magic. And as they delved deeper into Elspeth's story, the mystery of the lilies, the nightmares, Martha's plea, began to shift, to transform, to take on a new dimension, a new layer of unsettling complexity. Was Elspeth truly a vengeful spirit, driven by malice and a desire to harm? Or was she perhaps a victim herself, trapped in a cycle of pain and resentment, her spirit restless, her story misunderstood, her motives more complex, more human than they had initially imagined? And if so, how did Martha fit into this story? Why was Martha trapped? And what did Elspeth Bellamy truly want? The afternoon sun began to wane, casting long shadows across the archives room, the air growing cooler, the silence deepening around them. Sarah and Elias paused in their research, their heads spinning with the fragments of information they had uncovered, their minds grappling with the complexities of Elspeth Bellamy's story, the unsettling questions it raised, the chilling implications it held for their quest to help Martha. They looked at each other, their faces pale in the fading light, their eyes reflecting the weight of the secrets they were unearthing, the darkness they were beginning to confront. The library, once a haven of quiet knowledge, now felt like a gateway to a shadowed past, a portal to a realm of spirits and secrets, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurring, where the whispers of folklore were taking on a terrifying reality. "We should take a break, Dad," Sarah said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the archives room. "My head is swimming with names and dates and accusations of witchcraft." Elias nodded, his own mind feeling similarly overwhelmed, the fragments of Elspeth Bellamy's story swirling within him, mixing with the chilling vision of Martha, her desperate plea, the lingering unease of Havenwood Cemetery. He rubbed his tired eyes, the scent of dust and old paper clinging to his clothes, the weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders. They gathered their notes, the copies of library records, the faded newspaper clipping, carefully placing them back in Sarah's bag. They thanked Mrs. Peterson, who offered them a sympathetic smile and a thermos of lukewarm coffee, a gesture of quiet understanding in the face of the unsettling history they were unearthing. Outside the library, the grey afternoon seemed to have deepened, the overcast sky threatening rain, the air growing colder, sharper, carrying the scent of damp leaves and approaching autumn. They walked in silence, the weight of their discovery settling upon them, the image of Elspeth Bellamy's unmarked grave, the single white lily, the spiral symbol, imprinted in their minds, a haunting reminder of the darkness they were beginning to confront. "What do you think, Dad?" Sarah asked finally, her voice low, breaking the silence. "About Elspeth, about the witchcraft accusations, about all of this." Elias sighed, his breath misting in the cold air. "I don't know what to think, Sarah," he admitted, his voice weary. "It's all so strange, so unsettling. Witchcraft, spirits, curses. I never believed in any of that before. But now I don't know what to believe. It's hard to dismiss it now, isn't it? Sarah said softly, her gaze fixed on the grey pavement, her steps slow and deliberate. Not after everything that's happened. Not after Martha and your nightmares and the lilies and Elspeth's grave. They walked on in silence for a while longer, the town of Havenwood seeming to huddle around them, its familiar streets and buildings taking on a different aspect in the fading light, imbued with a sense of history, of mystery, of something unseen lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. Maybe we should go back to the cemetery, Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence again, her voice thoughtful, almost hesitant. Maybe there's something else we missed. Something at Elspeth's grave. Some clue, some sign, something that can help us understand what's going on. Elias hesitated, a shiver of unease running down his spine at the thought of returning to the cemetery in the gathering gloom. But Sarah's suggestion resonated with a strange sense of urgency, a feeling that the answers they sought were not just buried in the library archives, but also hidden within the ancient stones, the whispering trees, the unmarked grave of Elspeth Bellamy. "All right, Sarah," Elias said, his voice firming with a renewed resolve. "Let's go back to the cemetery. One last look before it gets too dark." They turned and retraced their steps, walking back towards Havenwood Cemetery, the afternoon shadows lengthening, the air growing colder, the silence deepening around them. As they approached the cemetery gates, they saw a familiar figure in the distance, moving slowly amongst the rows of stones. Silas, the groundskeeper, his weathered form a familiar fixture in the landscape of the dead. Silas was tending to a grave near the entrance, weeding with slow, deliberate movements, his gaze fixed on the task at hand. He didn't look up as Elias and Sarah approached, his presence as silent and unassuming as the ancient stones he tended. "Silas," Elias said, his voice quiet, acknowledging the groundskeeper's presence, his tone carrying a hint of the unease that now always accompanied his visits to the cemetery. Silas straightened slowly, turning to face them, his movements stiff and deliberate, his denim eyes regarding them with their usual unreadable neutrality. "Elias," Silas acknowledged in his low rumble of a voice. "Sarah," he nodded to Sarah, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture of recognition. "Silas, we were just taking another walk through the cemetery," Elias said, his voice slightly hesitant, unsure how to explain their renewed presence, their deepening investigation into the town's shadowed past. Silas remained silent for a moment, his gaze drifting across the rows of graves, then back to Elias and Sarah, his expression unchanging, his eyes holding a deep, unreadable knowledge of the cemetery and its secrets. "This is a place of peace, Elias," Silas said finally, his voice low and measured. "A place for the dead to rest. It's best to let them rest in peace." His words, seemingly innocuous, carried a subtle weight, a veiled warning, a gentle discouragement from disturbing the silence of the cemetery, from delving too deeply into its hidden history. Elias felt a flicker of unease, a sense that Silas knew more than he was letting on, that the groundskeeper's taciturn pronouncements held a deeper meaning, a veiled understanding of the unsettling forces at play in Havenwood Cemetery. "We understand, Silas," Sarah said, her voice polite but firm, her gaze meeting Silas's steady gaze. "We just wanted to pay our respects. To Martha." She gestured towards the older section of the cemetery, in the direction of Elspeth Bellamy's unmarked grave, though she didn't mention Elspeth's name, didn't want to reveal the true purpose of their return. Silas followed her gaze, his eyes settling on the older section of the cemetery, his expression remaining unreadable. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the shadows of the ancient stones. Then he spoke again, his voice low, almost a murmur, as if confiding a secret to the wind itself. "The old part of the cemetery, that's old ground, Elias, Sarah, very old, many things buried there, not just bodies." His words echoed his previous cryptic pronouncements, amplifying the sense of unease, hinting at deeper layers of mystery, suggesting that the cemetery held secrets beyond the ordinary realm of death and remembrance. Elias felt a chill run down his spine, Silas's words resonating with the unsettling vision of Martha, her desperate plea, the growing certainty that they were stepping into a realm beyond their comprehension. "We know, Silas," Elias said, his voice quiet, acknowledging the groundskeeper's cryptic warning, his gaze searching Silas's unreadable face, trying to discern the depth of his knowledge, the nature of his understanding. "We're just being respectful. We wouldn't want to disturb anything." Silas nodded slowly, his gaze drifting away, back to the grave he had been tending, his silence closing around him like a shroud. "Some things are best left undisturbed, Elias," Silas repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "For the sake of the living and the dead." He turned back to his weeding, his silence dismissing them, his presence a silent guardian of the cemetery's secrets, a taciturn warning against delving too deeply into the shadowed past. Elias and Sarah exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding of the groundskeeper's cryptic pronouncements, a shared sense of unease, a shared determination to continue their quest, despite the unspoken warnings, despite the growing sense of danger. They nodded to Silas, a brief, silent acknowledgement, and walked past him, towards the older section of the cemetery, towards the unmarked grave of Elspeth Bellamy, towards the heart of the mystery that was drawing them deeper into Havenwood's haunted past. As they walked away from Silas, towards the older section of the cemetery, Elias felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the subtle energies of the hallowed ground. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, the silence more profound, the sense of being watched more intense. He glanced back at Silas, the groundskeeper's weathered form still bent over the grave, his presence a silent sentinel, his gaze unseen, perhaps following them, watching their every move. They reached the unmarked field, the overgrown patch of ground standing out starkly against the ordered rows of marked graves. The single white lily still bloomed in the center, its luminescence seeming to intensify in the deepening twilight, its fragrance even more potent, almost cloying in the still air. They approached the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, the spiral symbol carved into its corner, the silent witness to forgotten life, a buried scandal, a haunting mystery. As they drew closer, Elias noticed something different, something he hadn't seen before, something subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. At the base of the headstone, nestled amongst the weeds and grass, were a few small pebbles, arranged in a deliberate pattern, a simple circle surrounding the base of the lily stem. Pebbles, not randomly scattered, but carefully placed, forming a protective circle around the lily, around the grave of Elspeth Bellamy. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. Pebbles. Who would place pebbles around Elspeth's grave? It seemed deliberate, intentional, not a random act of nature, not a casual scattering of stones. Someone had been here recently, tending to this unmarked grave, caring for the single white lily, placing pebbles in a protective circle around it. But who and why? He looked at Sarah, his eyes questioning, his mind racing, trying to decipher the meaning of the pebbles, the identity of the unseen visitor, the purpose of this subtle, almost ritualistic act. Sarah frowned as well, her gaze fixed on the pebbles, her expression thoughtful, her librarian's mind searching for connections, for patterns, for answers in the subtle details of the scene. "Dad, look," Sarah said softly, pointing to the pebbles, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's been here, recently. These pebbles, they weren't here this morning, or yesterday." Elias nodded slowly, his unease deepening, the mystery of the unmarked grave taking on a new layer of complexity, a new element of human intervention, a new question mark hanging over their quest for the truth. "Who, Sarah?" Elias murmured, his voice hushed, his gaze sweeping across the cemetery, searching for any sign of another presence, any hint of the unseen visitor. Who would be tending to Elspeth's grave, after all these years? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a figure emerged from the shadows of the ancient oaks, moving slowly, deliberately, towards them, towards the unmarked field, towards the grave of Elspeth Bellamy. A familiar figure, his weathered form instantly recognizable, his gait slow and deliberate, his denim eyes unreadable in the fading light. Silas, the groundskeeper, his presence no longer silent and unassuming, but purposeful, almost expectant. Silas approached them, his steps crunching softly on the gravel path, his gaze fixed on Elias and Sarah, his expression still unreadable, but his eyes holding a new intensity, a new depth of something unsettling. He stopped a few feet away from them, his presence filling the small space, his silence hanging heavy in the air, charged with an unspoken tension. "Silas," Elias said, his voice hesitant, questioning, his heart pounding in his chest, a sudden premonition of something significant about to unfold, something that would shatter the fragile peace of Havenwood Cemetery, something that would reveal the truth behind the lilies, the nightmares, the weeping woman legend, the darkness that haunted their lives. Silas nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from Elias to Sarah, then back to Elias, his denim eyes holding a deep, unreadable knowledge, a silent confession, a veiled revelation. Elias, Silas said finally, his voice low, measured, almost conspiratorial. Sarah, you've been asking questions about the cemetery, about the old stories. Elias and Sarah exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding in unison, a shared sense of anticipation, of apprehension, of stepping onto the precipice of a terrifying revelation. They waited, their breath held captive in their lungs, for Silas to continue, for the groundskeeper to finally break his silence, to reveal the secrets he had been guarding, the knowledge he had been concealing. Silas paused, his gaze drifting to the unmarked grave, to the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, to the single white lily, his expression softening slightly, a hint of something akin to sorrow, or perhaps regret, flickering across his weathered features. You want to know about the lilies, Elias? Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper, his words hanging heavy in the air, confirming their deepest suspicions, acknowledging the mystery that had brought them to this shadowed corner of Havenwood Cemetery. You want to know who's been leaving them on Martha's grave? Elias nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. Yes, Silas, he whispered. We need to know. Silas turned his gaze back to Elias, his denim eyes locking onto his expression hardening again, becoming more resolute, more determined. Then I'll tell you, Elias, Silas said, his voice firming, his tone taking on a new authority, a new purpose. I'll tell you the truth, because it's time you knew. It's time someone in this town understood about the cemetery, about the spirit, about what needs to be done. He paused, drawing a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the cemetery, the ancient stones, the whispering trees, the gathering gloom, as if gathering strength, as if preparing to reveal a secret that had been buried for centuries, a truth that would change everything. Then he spoke again, his voice low, resonant, filled with a chilling certainty, a profound conviction, a revelation that would shatter the fragile peace of Havenwood and plunge Elias and Sarah deeper into the heart of the mystery, towards an unknown, terrifying destiny. I'm the one leaving the lilies, Elias, Silas confessed, his voice unwavering, his gaze steady, his words hanging heavy in the air, a shocking revelation that resonated with a chilling truth, a confession that would unravel the mystery of the flowers, but only to reveal a deeper, more unsettling secret, a truth that would bind them to Havenwood Cemetery, to Elspeth Bellamy, to the weeping woman legend, in ways they could never have imagined. And I've been doing it for a reason you need to understand, a reason that involves you and Martha and this town, because the spirit is waking, and it needs our help to restore the balance, to heal Havenwood, and the lilies are just the beginning. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, her eyes widening in stunned disbelief as Silas's words hung in the air, heavy and resonant. Elias stood frozen, his aged features etched with a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning sense of understanding. The confession, so unexpected, so utterly out of left field, momentarily robbed them of speech, leaving them staring at Silas, the taciturn groundskeeper, the silent guardian of Havenwood Cemetery, now revealed as the orchestrator of the floral mystery that had so deeply unsettled them. You're leaving the lilies, Sarah finally managed to stammer, her voice barely a whisper, her mind struggling to process the sudden shift in the narrative, the unexpected turn in their quest for answers. But why? Why on Martha's grave? Elias remained silent for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Silas, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet groundskeeper with the unsettling mystery of the lilies, the creeping dread, the whispers of folklore, and the terrifying vision of Martha. Then slowly, deliberately, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, laced with a mixture of confusion and a desperate plea for clarity. Silas, why? We thought it was something else. Something supernatural. Silas nodded slowly, his denim eyes holding a depth of sorrow and understanding that surprised Elias. It is, Elias. In a way, it is. The lilies, they are a message, a signal, a call, but not from who you think. He paused, his gaze drifting to the unmarked grave, to the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, to the single white lily blooming in the center, its luminescence seeming to pulse in the deepening twilight. The lilies are for her, Elias, for Elspeth. Elspeth, Sarah repeated, her brow furrowing in confusion, the name of Martha's ancestor, the woman accused of witchcraft, suddenly taking center stage in the unfolding mystery. But why would you leave lilies for Elspeth Bellamy, in secret, and why on Martha's grave? Silas sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, the burden of Havenwood's shadowed past. It's complicated, Sarah. It goes back a long way, to Elspeth, to the weeping woman legend, to the balance of this place. He shifted his weight, his gaze sweeping across the cemetery, encompassing the ancient stones, the whispering trees, the hallowed ground itself. This cemetery, Elias, Sarah, it's more than just a resting place for the dead. It's a nexus, a point where worlds meet, where the veil between the living and the dead is thin. And Elspeth Bellamy, she's at the heart of it. He turned his gaze back to Elias, his denim eyes locking onto his expression becoming more intense, more urgent. The weeping woman legend, it's not just a story, Elias. It's a warning, a reminder of what happens when the balance is broken, when the past is forgotten, when the spirits are restless. But what does this have to do with the lilies? Elias pressed, his voice laced with a growing impatience, a desperate need to understand the connection, to unravel the layers of mystery that were unfolding before them. And Martha, why are the lilies on Martha's grave? Silas nodded, acknowledging Elias' questions, his gaze softening again, a hint of sorrow flickering across his weathered features. Martha is important, Elias, more important than you know. Her grave, it's a focal point, a place of connection. And the lilies are a way to draw attention, to signal that something is happening, something awakening. Awakening, Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, her mind racing, trying to grasp the implications of Silas's words, the unsettling sense of forces beyond their comprehension stirring within Havenwood Cemetery. What's awakening, Silas? What are you talking about? Silas paused again, his gaze drifting back to Elspeth's unmarked grave, the single white lily glowing in the twilight, a silent beacon in the gathering gloom. The spirit, Sarah, Silas said finally, his voice low and resonant, filled with a chilling certainty. Elspeth's spirit, the weeping woman. She's been dormant for centuries, Elias, Sarah, trapped, bound to this place. But something is changing. The balance is shifting, and she's waking up. A cold dread washed over Elias, Silas's words confirming his deepest fears. The terrifying vision of Martha, her desperate plea, the unsettling nightmares, all coalescing into a chilling realization. Elspeth Bellamy, the weeping woman, was not just a legend, not just a ghost from Havenwood's past, but a living, or rather, undead presence, stirring in the shadows of the cemetery, awakening from a centuries-long slumber, and somehow, inexplicably, connected to Martha, to him, to the lilies, to the encroaching darkness that threatened to consume Havenwood. But why lilies on Martha's grave? Elias asked again, his voice trembling slightly, his mind still struggling to grasp the connection, to understand the logic, if any, behind Silas's actions, the spirit's awakening, the lily's mysterious appearance. Why not Elspeth's grave? Why Martha? Silas turned his gaze back to Elias, his denim eyes holding a deep, almost mournful understanding. Because Elspeth doesn't have a marked grave, Elias, Silas said, his voice heavy with a somber truth. Not one that anyone remembers. Her grave is unmarked, forgotten, lost to time. And that's part of the problem, part of why she's restless, part of why she's awakening. He gestured towards the unmarked field, the overgrown patch of ground stretching around them, the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy almost swallowed by the encroaching vegetation. This grave, Elias, Sarah, is not supposed to be unmarked. It's not supposed to be forgotten. Elspeth Bellamy, she was wronged in this town. Accused, condemned, buried in shame. Her story was erased, her memory suppressed. And that imbalance, that injustice, it's festered for centuries. It's poisoned the land. It's disturbed the spirits. But why did you start leaving lilies now? Sarah asked, her voice thoughtful, her librarian's mind seeking to establish a timeline, to understand the trigger, the catalyst for the recent surge in unexplained phenomena, for the spirit's awakening, for Silas's sudden intervention. Why now, after all these years? Silas sighed again, his gaze drifting to the darkening sky, as if searching for answers in the swirling clouds above. It started, subtly at first, Silas said, his voice becoming more distant, more introspective, as if recounting a long unfolding narrative, a slow, creeping sense of unease that had been building within Havenwood for years. A few years back, I started noticing changes in the cemetery. Unusual cold spots, faint whispers in the wind, a sense of unease, especially in the old section near Elspeth's grave. The trees seemed to wither slightly in that area, the grass grew sparser. The stones felt colder to the touch. Subtle things at first, things most folks wouldn't notice. But I did, I always have. I feel things in this cemetery, things others don't. He paused, then continued, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. Then, a few months ago, it started to intensify. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. The cold spots grew colder, more localized, centered around Elspeth's grave. The livestock mutilations started in the valley. The unsettling feeling in the town, it grew stronger, more pervasive. People started talking about it, feeling it, even if they didn't understand what it was. And the lilies, Elias prompted, his voice barely audible, his heart pounding in his chest, a sense of dread building within him, a premonition of something terrible about to unfold. When did you start leaving the lilies? Silas turned his gaze back to Elias, his denim eyes locking onto his expression becoming more solemn, more resolute. The lilies, I started leaving them when I realized, when I understood what was happening, Silas said, his voice low, measured, each word hanging heavy in the air. When I realized that Elspeth was awakening, that the balance was about to shift, that Havenwood was in danger. He paused again, drawing a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the cemetery, the ancient stones, the whispering trees, the gathering gloom, as if gathering strength, as if preparing to reveal a secret that had been buried for centuries, a truth that would change everything. Then he spoke again, his voice low, resonant, filled with a chilling certainty, a profound conviction, a revelation that would shatter the fragile peace of Havenwood and plunge Elias and Sarah deeper into the heart of the mystery, towards an unknown, terrifying destiny. The lilies, Elias, Silas said, his voice unwavering, his gaze steady, his words hanging heavy in the air, a shocking revelation that resonated with a chilling truth, a confession that would unravel the mystery of the flowers, but only to reveal a deeper, more unsettling secret, a truth that would bind them to Havenwood Cemetery, to Elspeth Bellamy, to the Weeping Woman legend, in ways they could never have imagined. The lilies are an offering, Elias, a plea, a way to appease her, to acknowledge her, to try and calm her spirit, to keep her from fully awakening, to keep her from unleashing her anger, her pain, her vengeance upon Havenwood. His words hung in the air, heavy and chilling, painting a terrifying picture of Elspeth Bellamy, the Weeping Woman, not just as a tragic figure from Havenwood's past, but as a potentially dangerous, vengeful spirit, awakening from a centuries-long slumber, threatening to unleash a wave of darkness upon the town. And the lilies, the mysterious lilies on Martha's grave, revealed not as a random act of kindness, not as a figment of Elias' imagination, but as a desperate, secret ritual, a silent plea for appeasement, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness, orchestrated by Silas, the taciturn groundskeeper, the unlikely guardian of Havenwood Cemetery, the keeper of its secrets, the silent witness to its haunted history, and now, perhaps, the key to its salvation, or its doom. The mystery of the lilies was solved, but in its place, a far greater, more terrifying mystery had emerged, a mystery that bound Elias and Sarah to Havenwood, to Martha, to Elspeth Bellamy, to the Weeping Woman legend, in ways they were only just beginning to understand, a mystery that whispered of ancient curses, restless spirits, and a darkness that was stirring, awakening, and reaching out from the grave into the fading light of day. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the ancient oaks, carrying with it a faint, mournful whisper, a sound that seemed to echo Elspeth's name, a chilling reminder of the spirit that was awakening, the darkness that was descending, and the desperate need to understand the secrets of Havenwood Cemetery before it was too late. Sarah and Elias stared at Silas, the groundskeeper's confession hanging in the air like the heavy scent of lilies, a fragrant yet unsettling truth. The wind seemed to hold its breath, the rustling leaves momentarily stilled, as if even the ancient trees of Havenwood Cemetery were listening, waiting to hear the secret Silas was about to reveal. "Appease her," Sarah repeated, her voice laced with disbelief and a tremor of fear. "You think leaving lilies is appeasing a vengeful spirit, the weeping woman of Havenwood?" Silas nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering, his denim eyes holding a depth of conviction that was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. "It's a gesture, Sarah, a small offering, a way to show respect, to acknowledge her presence, to try and reason with her in a way." He paused, then added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "It's all I know how to do." Elias, still reeling from the shock of Silas's confession and the chilling implications of the spirit's awakening, found his voice, his tone laced with a desperate urgency. "But why Martha's grave, Silas? Why not Elspeth's? And why now? Why is she awakening now, after all these years?" Silas sighed, his gaze drifting to the unmarked field, to the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, the single white lily, as if seeking answers in the silent stones, in the whispering wind, in the very earth of Havenwood Cemetery. "Martha's grave, it's a nexus, Elias, like I said, a point of connection. You've been coming here week after week, for years, pouring your grief, your love, your memories into this place. You've created her a conduit, a channel between this world and the next. And Elspeth, she's drawn to it. Drawn to the energy, the emotion, the vulnerability." He turned his gaze back to Elias, his denim eyes holding a deep, almost mournful understanding. "Martha was a good woman, Elias, a kind soul, and her love for you, your love for her, it's a powerful thing. But grief can be powerful too, and vulnerable. And Elspeth, she can sense that vulnerability. She can use it." "Use it for what?" Sarah pressed, her voice sharp with a growing anxiety, her librarian's mind demanding clarity, seeking to understand the spirit's motives, her purpose in awakening, her connection to Martha, to Elias, to Havenwood. "What does Elspeth want, Silas? What is she trying to do?" Silas hesitated, his gaze drifting again, sweeping across the cemetery, the ancient stones, the whispering trees, as if reluctant to reveal the full extent of his knowledge, the true depth of the darkness he sensed stirring within Havenwood Cemetery. "She wants balance, Sarah, justice, remembrance, for herself, for her story, for what was done to her in this town. She was wronged, Elias, Sarah, deeply wronged. And that wrong, it's festered for centuries. It's poisoned this land. It's disturbed the spirits. And now she's seeking to rectify it, to set things right, in her own way." "But Martha," Elias interjected, his voice laced with a desperate plea. "Martha said she's trapped, that Elspeth is holding her. What does Martha have to do with this? Why is Elspeth holding Martha?" Silas's gaze softened, a deep sorrow clouding his denim eyes. Martha is caught in the crosscurrents, Elias. She's a bridge, in a way, a link between you and Elspeth, between the living world and the spirit realm. Your grief, your love for her, your connection to this cemetery, it's drawn her spirit here, closer to Elspeth, closer to the veil. And Elspeth, she's using Martha in a way, to get your attention, to draw you into her story, to make you understand, to make you help her." "Help her," Sarah repeated, her brow furrowing in confusion, her mind struggling to grasp the convoluted logic of Silas's explanation, the unsettling implications of the spirit's motives. Help Elspeth, but how? And help her do what? Unleash her vengeance on Havenwood. Silas shook his head slowly, his gaze becoming more intense, more urgent. "No, Sarah, not vengeance. Not anymore. That's not what she truly wants, not deep down. Beneath the anger, beneath the pain, beneath the centuries of resentment, what Elspeth truly wants is peace. For herself, for Havenwood, for the spirits of this place. But she doesn't know how to find it, not anymore. She's lost, Sarah, confused, trapped in her own pain, her own anger, her own story. And you think we can help her find peace?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible, a fragile spark of hope flickering within the encroaching darkness, a desperate yearning to help Martha, to break her free from Elspeth's grasp, to somehow bring an end to the haunting mystery that had consumed their lives. Silas nodded, his gaze unwavering, his denim eyes holding a profound conviction. "Yes, Elias, I do. I believe you can, you and Sarah. You're connected to Martha, to this cemetery, to Havenwood's past. You're drawn into this story for a reason. And I believe you're meant to be the ones to help her, to help Elspeth, to help Havenwood heal. But how, Sealers? Sarah pressed again, her voice urgent, her librarian's mind seeking a plan of action, a concrete path forward through the labyrinth of mystery and folklore. How do we help a vengeful spirit find peace? What do we need to do? Sealers paused, his gaze drifting back to Elspeth's unmarked grave, the single white lily, the circle of pebbles, as if seeking guidance from the spirit herself, as if listening to whispers carried on the wind, secrets murmuring from the earth. We need to remember her story, Sarah, Sealers said finally, his voice low, resonant, filled with a chilling certainty. We need to tell her story. We need to acknowledge her pain, her injustice, her truth. We need to give her back her name, her memory, her rightful place in Havenwood's history. That's what she wants, I think. That's what she needs. To be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. Not as a witch, not as a vengeful spirit, but as Elspeth Bellamy, a woman wronged, a soul in pain, a spirit seeking peace. He turned his gaze back to Elias and Sarah, his denim eyes locking onto theirs, his expression becoming more resolute, more determined. And the lilies, Elias, Sarah, Sealers said, his voice firming, his tone taking on a new urgency. The lilies, they're not just an offering, they're a guide. They're leading you to her, to Elspeth's grave, to her story, to the truth that's buried here beneath Havenwood Cemetery. You need to follow the lilies, Elias. You need to follow them to the source. And you need to listen to what Elspeth has to say. Because only then can you help her. Only then can you help Martha. Only then can you help Havenwood heal. Sealers' words hung in the air, heavy with a chilling certainty, a profound conviction, a revelation that both terrified and galvanized Elias and Sarah. A call to action, a desperate plea for understanding, a journey into the heart of Havenwood's haunted past, a quest to unravel the mystery of Elspeth Bellamy, the weeping woman, to confront the darkness that was awakening, and to somehow, miraculously, find a path towards peace, for Martha, for Elspeth, for Havenwood, and for themselves. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves of the ancient oaks, carrying with it a faint, mournful whisper, a sound that seemed to echo Elspeth's name, a chilling reminder of the spirit that was stirring, the darkness that was descending, and the desperate need to listen, to remember, to understand, before it was too late. The lilies on Martha's grave, now understood as a guiding light, a desperate plea from beyond the veil, beckoned them forward, into the deepening shadows of Havenwood Cemetery, towards an unknown destiny, a confrontation with a past that refused to stay buried, a journey into the heart of a haunting that had only just begun. Sealers' confession hung heavy in the twilight air, a revelation that shifted the ground beneath Elias' feet, replacing the chilling mystery of the lilies with a more profound, more daunting task. Appeasing a vengeful spirit, remembering a forgotten story, healing a centuries-old wound, the weight of it all pressed down on him, a burden far heavier than his aged shoulders were accustomed to bearing. He looked at Sealers, then at Sarah, his gaze moving between them, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what they were facing, the impossible task that lay before them. "Tell us, Sealers," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the tremor of unease that ran through it. "Tell us everything. Everything you know about Elspeth, about the weeping woman, about how we can help her, and Martha." Her librarian's instinct for order and information was kicking in, a desperate need to understand the mechanics of this spectral drama, to find a logical path through the illogical realm of spirits and folklore. Sealers nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping once more across the cemetery, as if invoking the silent witnesses to Havenwood's history, the ancient stones, the whispering trees, the spirits themselves. "It goes back a long way, like I said," Sealers began, his voice low and resonant, weaving a narrative that felt both ancient and immediate, both folklore and stark reality. To the early days of Havenwood, when the valley was still raw and wild, when the mountains held more secrets than settlers. Elspeth Bellamy, she was different back then. They say she was touched by the old ways, by the spirits of the land. She knew herbs, she knew healing, she knew things that most folks didn't understand, things they feared. He paused, his gaze softening, a hint of sadness flickering across his weathered features. She was a healer, Elias, Sarah, a wise woman. But in those days, wisdom could be mistaken for witchcraft. Knowledge could be twisted into fear. And fear is a powerful thing in a small town like Havenwood. He continued, his voice taking on a somber tone, recounting the fragmented story they had begun to piece together in the library archives. The whispers of accusations, the cloud of suspicion, the harsh winter, the unexplained misfortunes, the scapegoating of Elspeth Bellamy. They accused her of witchcraft, Elias, Sarah, Silas said, his voice heavy with a sense of injustice. Of consorting with dark forces, of cursing the land, of bringing sickness and misfortune upon Havenwood. They said she was in league with the devil, that her knowledge came from unnatural sources, that she was a threat to their God-fearing community. But was she? Sarah asked, her voice hesitant, her mind still grappling with the possibility of genuine malevolence, of a truly vengeful spirit. Was Elspeth really a witch? Did she do anything to deserve those accusations? Silas shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the unmarked grave, his expression one of quiet certainty. No, Sarah, she wasn't a witch. Not in the way they accused her. She was just different. She understood things they didn't. She had a connection to the land, to the old ways, to the spirits that dwell in these mountains, and they feared what they didn't understand. They punished her for it. He paused, drawing a deep breath, his voice taking on a more mournful quality. They put her on trial, Elias, Sarah, a mockery of justice, fueled by fear and prejudice. They paraded her through the town square, accused her before the whole community, listened to whispers and rumors as if they were gospel truth, and in the end they condemned her. They found her guilty of witchcraft. They sentenced her to be banished from Havenwood. And they buried her here, in this unmarked grave, in shame and disgrace, hoping to erase her memory, to silence her story, to bury the darkness they believed she represented. But they didn't banish her, Silas, Elias said, his voice barely audible, his mind reeling with the tragic tale, the chilling injustice, the centuries-long echo of Elspeth's pain. They buried her here, in Havenwood Cemetery. Silas nodded slowly, his gaze locking onto Elias, his denim eyes holding a deep, almost mournful understanding. They thought they were banishing her, Elias, Silas said, his voice low, resonant, filled with a chilling certainty. But they were wrong. They didn't banish her, they trapped her, here, in Havenwood Cemetery, bound to this place by their fear, their injustice, their hatred. And that's why she's restless, Elias. That's why she's awakening, because she's still here, trapped, forgot, and angry. And Martha, Sarah interjected, her voice urgent, her mind returning to the immediate crisis, to the desperate plea of Martha's spirit. How does Martha fit into all of this? Why is Elspeth holding her? Silas sighed again, his gaze softening, a deep sorrow clouding his denim eyes. Like I said, Sarah, Martha is a bridge, a link. Your grief, Elias, your love for Martha, your constant visits to her grave, it's created a connection, a pathway for Elspeth to reach out, to be heard, to be seen. Martha's spirit, it's sensitive, receptive. And Elspeth, she's drawn to that sensitivity, to that vulnerability. She's using Martha, in a way, to amplify her voice, to make her presence known, to draw your attention, to compel you to listen to her story, to understand her pain, to help her find peace. But how do we help her, Silas? Elias asked, his voice laced with desperation, a desperate yearning to break the cycle, to save Martha, to appease the vengeful spirit, to heal the wounds of Havenwood's past. What do we need to do? Silas paused, his gaze drifting back to the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy, the spiral symbol carved into its corner, the circle of pebbles at its base, as if seeking guidance from the spirit herself, as if listening to whispers carried on the wind, secrets murmuring from the earth. We need to remember her story, Elias, Sarah, Silas repeated, his voice low, resonant, filled with a chilling certainty. We need to tell her story. We need to acknowledge her pain, her injustice, her truth. We need to give her back her name, her memory, her rightful place in Havenwood's history. That's what she wants, I think. That's what she needs. To be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. Not as a witch, not as a vengeful spirit, but as Elspeth Bellamy, a woman wronged, a soul in pain, a spirit seeking peace. And the locket? Sarah asked suddenly, her voice thoughtful, her librarian's mind piecing together the fragments of information, recalling the story outline, the key element that had been hinted at, the potential weakness of the vengeful spirit. Martha's locket. Does it have something to do with this? Is it important? Silas's gaze sharpened, a flicker of something akin to recognition or perhaps surprise crossing his weathered features. The locket, Silas repeated, his voice questioning, his denim eyes searching Sarah's face, as if trying to understand how she knew about it. Martha's locket. How do you know about the locket, Sarah? Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain, how to reveal the almost intuitive sense that had led her to ask about the locket, the feeling that it was more than just a piece of jewelry, that it held a deeper significance, a hidden connection to the mystery. It's just a feeling, Silas, Sarah said finally, her voice slightly hesitant. A sense that it's important, that it's connected to Martha, to Elspeth, to all of this. Silas studied her face for a long moment, his gaze searching, assessing, then he nodded slowly, a hint of understanding dawning in his denim eyes. The locket, Silas murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. Yes, Sarah, the locket is important, very important, more important than you know. He paused, then continued, his voice taking on a new urgency, a new direction, leading them towards a potential path forward, a possible solution to the haunting mystery, a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. Martha's locket, Elias, Silas said, turning his gaze to Elias, his denim eyes locking onto his expression becoming more resolute, more determined. It's not just a piece of jewelry. It's a relic, Elias, a connection to Martha's soul, and it holds a power. A power that might be the key to helping Elspeth, to freeing Martha, to bringing peace to Havenwood. What kind of power, Silas? Elias asked, his voice barely audible, his heart pounding in his chest, a fragile spark of hope rekindling within the encroaching darkness, a desperate yearning to grasp at any possibility, any chance to save Martha, to end the haunting, to find a way through the labyrinth of mystery and fear that had consumed their lives. What power does the locket hold? Silas's gaze softened, a hint of something akin to tenderness, or perhaps compassion, flickering across his weathered features. The power of love, Elias, Silas whispered, his voice barely above a breath, his words hanging in the air, luminous and resonant, a simple yet profound truth revealed in the heart of Havenwood Cemetery, in the twilight gloom, amidst the ancient stones and the whispering trees, a truth that might be the key to unlocking the mystery, to banishing the darkness, to bringing peace to the restless spirit of Elspeth Bellamy, and to finally freeing Martha's soul. Martha's love, Elias. The love she had for you, the love she had for life, the love that still lingers even beyond death. That love is a powerful force, Elias, a force that even a spirit like Elspeth might not be able to withstand. And the locket is a conduit for that love, a vessel for Martha's soul. If we can use it, if we can channel Martha's love through the locket, we might be able to reach Elspeth, to break through her anger, her pain, her resentment, to remind her of the good, the light, the hope that still exists, even in the darkness. We might be able to help her find peace, Elias, and in doing so, we might be able to free Martha and heal Havenwood. His words resonated with a fragile hope, a desperate possibility, a glimmer of light in the encroaching darkness, a path forward through the labyrinth of mystery and fear. The locket, Martha's locket, a simple piece of jewelry, now revealed as a potential weapon against the vengeful spirit, a conduit for love, a key to unlocking the secrets of Havenwood Cemetery, and perhaps the salvation of their souls. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound that seemed to echo Martha's name, a hopeful breath carried on the night air, a silent plea for help, a fragile promise of peace. The lilies on Martha's grave, now understood as a guide, a beacon, a desperate call for action, beckoned them forward towards the final confrontation, towards the unknown destiny that awaited them in the heart of Havenwood Cemetery, armed with nothing but love, memory, and a small silver locket, hoping against hope that it would be enough to banish the darkness, to appease the spirit, to bring peace to the haunted town, and to finally bring Martha home. Silas's words hung in the twilight air, the power of love, Martha's love, a fragile weapon against a vengeful spirit, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. Elias felt a tremor run through him, a mixture of awe and disbelief, a desperate yearning to believe in this impossible possibility, to grasp at this slender thread of hope in the face of despair. He looked at Sarah, his daughter's face pale but resolute, her eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight from the cemetery entrance. Her gaze fixed on Silas, waiting, listening, ready to act. "The locket," Elias whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the rustling leaves and the distant murmur of the creek. "Martha's locket. You think it can really help us?" Silas nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering, his denim eyes holding a profound conviction. "I believe it can, Elias. It's more than just metal and stone, that locket. It holds a piece of Martha's soul, a spark of her love. And love, true love, it's a force that transcends death, a power that even spirits can feel. We have to try, Elias. We have to use it." Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm, cutting through the lingering twilight gloom. "Where is it, Dad? Martha's locket. Do you still have it?" Elias hesitated, his mind searching through the mists of grief and memory, dredging up images of Martha's belongings, her cherished possessions, carefully stored away, untouched since her passing. "Yes," he said slowly, his voice gaining strength, a flicker of determination igniting within him. "Yes, I have it. It sits at the cottage, in her jewelry box. I haven't looked at it in years." "We need it, Dad," Sarah said, her voice urgent, her librarian's practicality overriding her initial shock and fear. "We need to get the locket, now, before it's too late." Elias nodded, his gaze locking onto Sarah's, a shared understanding passing between them, a silent agreement to act, to fight back against the encroaching darkness, to embrace this fragile hope, this impossible possibility. "Yes, Sarah, you're right. We need to get the locket." He turned to Silas, his voice firming with resolve. "Silas, will you come with us, back to the cottage? And then what do we do? How do we use the locket? How do we reach Elspeth?" Silas nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, his gaze sweeping across the cemetery one last time, a silent farewell to the hallowed ground, a tacit acknowledgement of the perilous journey that lay ahead. "I'll come with you, Elias, to the cottage, and then we go back to Elspeth's grave, to the unmarked field with the locket, and we try to reach her. We try to show her Martha's love. We try to remind her of the light. We try to help her find peace." His voice trailed off, his gaze becoming distant, almost lost in the shadows of the cemetery, a hint of uncertainty, of apprehension flickering in his denim eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the immense risk they were about to take, the unknown dangers that lay ahead, the terrifying possibility that their fragile hope might be shattered, their desperate attempt to appease a vengeful spirit might fail, leaving them and Havenwood at the mercy of the awakening darkness. They turned and walked away from the unmarked grave, leaving the single white lily glowing in the twilight gloom, the headstone of Elspeth Bellamy a silent sentinel in the gathering darkness. They walked quickly, their steps echoing on the gravel path, their hearts pounding in their chests, a mixture of fear and anticipation churning within them. Silas walked beside them, his presence a quiet reassurance, his weathered form a familiar anchor in the swirling uncertainty. They didn't speak, the weight of their task, the immensity of the mystery, the chilling prospect of confronting a vengeful spirit, hanging heavy between them, unspoken, yet undeniably present. They reached Elias' cottage, the familiar warmth of the kerosene lamp in the window, a welcome sight, a beacon of normalcy in the encroaching darkness. They stepped inside, the familiar scent of wood smoke and old books washing over them, a temporary respite from the oppressive atmosphere of the cemetery. Elias went directly to Martha's jewelry box, a small, intricately carved wooden chest that sat on her dresser, a silent repository of her cherished memories, her personal treasures, her enduring presence in the empty cottage. He opened the box, the hinges creaking softly, the scent of lavender and dried roses wafting upwards, a poignant reminder of Martha's gentle touch, her enduring grace. Inside, nestled amongst velvet linings and faded ribbons, lay Martha's locket, a small silver heart, intricately engraved with delicate floral patterns, its surface tarnished with time, yet still gleaming with a faint inner luminescence. Elias picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the cool metal in his palm, the weight of it feeling strangely significant, heavier than its size would suggest, imbued with a presence beyond mere material form. He opened the locket, the tiny hinges clicking softly, revealing two miniature portraits, faded and yellowed with age, yet still recognizable, still vibrant with the echo of lives lived and loved. On one side, a younger Martha, her eyes bright with laughter, her smile radiant with joy, her youthful beauty captured in a timeless image of love and happiness. On the other side, a younger Elias, his hair darker, his face less weathered, his gaze filled with a hopeful tenderness, a reflection of the love they had shared, the life they had built together, the enduring bond that transcended time and death. He closed the locket, the tiny click echoing in the silence of the cottage, the weight of it pressing down on his palm, a tangible link to Martha's soul, a vessel of her love, a potential weapon against the encroaching darkness. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation, a silent question hanging in the air, a plea for guidance, a desperate yearning for reassurance. Sarah stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the locket, her hand reaching out, gently touching the cool silver, her librarian's touch delicate, respectful, almost reverent. "It's beautiful, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and a hint of sadness, a recognition of the enduring love it represented, the profound loss it symbolized. "It feels warm. Even now, it feels like Martha." Silas nodded slowly, his gaze also fixed on the locket, his denim eyes holding a deep, knowing understanding. "It is Martha, Sarah. In a way, it is. Her essence, her love, her spirit, it's all held within that locket. And that's what we need to use. That's what we need to take back to the cemetery." "But how, Silas?" Elias asked again, his voice laced with desperation, his mind still struggling to grasp the mechanics of this spectral confrontation, the impossible task of wielding love as a weapon against a vengeful spirit. "How do we use it? How do we reach Elspeth? What do we do?" Silas took a deep breath, his gaze becoming more focused, more resolute, his voice firming with a newfound authority, a quiet confidence that seemed to draw strength from the very air around them, from the presence of Martha's locket, from the unspoken hope that flickered in the encroaching darkness. "We go back to Elspeth's grave, Elias," Silas said, his voice low, resonant, filled with a chilling certainty. "To the unmarked field, with the locket, and we speak to her. We tell her Martha's story. We show her Martha's love. We let Martha's light shine through the darkness. We try to remind her of what it means to be human, to love, to forgive, to find peace. And we hope that it's enough. We hope that Martha's love can break through Elspeth's anger, her pain, her resentment. We hope that it can touch her soul. We hope that it can set her free. And Martha too." He paused, his gaze sweeping from Elias to Sarah, his denim eyes locking onto theirs, his expression becoming more intense, more urgent. "It won't be easy, Elias, Sarah," Silas cautioned, his voice firm but gentle. "It will be dangerous. Elspeth's spirit is powerful, restless, unpredictable. She's been trapped in darkness for centuries. Her anger, her pain, her resentment, they're deeply ingrained. She may not want to listen. She may resist us. She may even try to harm us. But we have to try. For Martha, for Havenwood, for Elspeth herself, we have to try to reach her heart. We have to try to bring her home." He gestured towards the door, towards the gathering darkness outside, towards the silent city of the dead that awaited them, towards the unknown confrontation that lay ahead. "It's time, Elias, Sarah," Silas said, his voice low, resonant, filled with a chilling certainty. "It's time to go back to the cemetery. It's time to face Elspeth Bellamy. It's time to use Martha's love to fight the darkness. It's time to see if we can bring peace to Havenwood and to bring Martha home." Elias looked at Sarah, his daughter's face pale but determined, her eyes mirroring his own mixture of fear and resolve, her hand reaching out, taking his, her touch a source of strength, a shared courage in the face of the unknown. He looked at the locket in his hand, Martha's locket, a small silver heart, a vessel of love, a fragile weapon against the darkness, a beacon of hope in the encroaching night. He closed his fingers around it, the cool metal warming in his palm, a sense of Martha's presence, her love, her enduring spirit, filling him with a renewed sense of purpose, a desperate yearning to succeed, to honor her memory, to fulfill her plea, to bring her peace, to bring peace to Havenwood, to bring peace to himself. He nodded slowly, his gaze locking onto Sarah's, a silent understanding passing between them, a shared commitment to face whatever lay ahead, to confront the darkness, to embrace the impossible hope, to use Martha's love as their shield, their sword, their guiding light. "Let's go, Sarah," Elias said, his voice firming with resolve, his steps steady as he turned towards the door, towards the gathering darkness, towards Havenwood Cemetery, towards Elspeth Bellamy, towards the unknown destiny that awaited them in the heart of the haunted town. He clutched Martha's locket tightly in his hand, a tangible link to love, to memory, to hope, and stepped out into the night, Sarah and Silas following close behind, their footsteps echoing in the silence, their hearts pounding in unison, their journey into the shadows just beginning.